down and out, worked dumb jobs. And in World War One, he read Schopenhauer back to back, emerged from World War One. And he understood the power of the will. He said he had a packet of cigarettes. He looked at them and thought, threw them in the river, and he marched onwards. Yeah, so he went from the DOS house to world conquest in 20 years, all from reading the self-help book by Schopenhauer. It should be a back page devoted to buy this book now.
That's
Look
right.
at this guy.
What a great example. So I figured today we can wrap up our little diversion. We diverted. Basically for those just joining us or watching us on the YouTube, we're the YouTube. Hey, that's like the mysterious tubes of the internet. So this is week 109 of our Kenneth Smith philosophy sequence, centering on his book Millennia and Microcosm. We're working on chapter 4, Ancient Civilizations. And we're in the last section of chapter 4, H, Sophism and Corruption, in which we're exploring the definition of sophrosune. He opens up, section H is talking about the ancient Greek fall from the peak, the pinnacle of their culture into sophistry and self-destruction. And it hinges on this concept of sophrosune. And sophrosune has this great value as a illuminating term to help us understand the difference between the modern worldview and the ancient worldview, which is why for 2 months I've been belaboring this. And I've been belaboring it by taking us on a little field trip off to F.M. Cornford's book, Thucydides Mythistoricus. And we've been exploring the way that Cornford describes the author of the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides, as trying to be objective, trying to remove all the hearsay and supernaturalism from his history and just say, this is what happened between Athens and Sparta and why they fought. And yet exploring the ways in which even when he makes that conscientious effort, we find fingerprints of the ancient worldview all over the way that he characterizes the causes of the war and why things happen the way they do. He doesn't explain why the way a modern was. There's no reference to, classes in conflict with each other. There's no reference to, different power groups, and how much were they able to mobilize physical resources to back them up. All the ways, all the different modern theories of history are absent. You can see them there if you want to, and as a modern, we project it into the work when we read it. But as Cornford points out, a closer inspection shows that he's using a completely alien worldview to make sense of what happens. And that alien worldview is the ancient worldview that Kenneth is trying to tell us about in chapter 4. He's trying to give us the ability to take off temporarily our modern worldview and put on the ancient worldview and see through its lenses. Because until we learn to see through the lenses of a different worldview, we will always be prisoners of the one we were born into, like the fish that can't imagine water. We can't imagine the blind spots that we have as moderns because we've always had them and everybody we know has had them. And anything that modernity can't see must be a non-thing, right? Because we're the smartest, most objective, culture that has ever existed in the history of the world, according to us. And the hubris of that, to cite Stephen's use of the term, the hubris of that is lost on us. I mean, it's like, that's not hubris. Those are just facts. It's just facts that we see like gods and understand like gods. So what Kenneth is trying to help us do here is to shake up that certainty by learning to see the world first in chapter 4, the way the ancients see it, and then in a group of chapters that follow, the way medievals see the world. And we'll be getting to them soon enough. Sometime this year. We'll finish up chapter 4 and move on to that. So we've talked about a lot of core ideas, and core to it is just about the opposite of the notion of the body as a machine and the brain as a computer and knowledge and wisdom and virtue as mere information to be poured in through an education and testing process. This is the modern picture of a person. They have sort of the opposite. They see the mind as an organism. It's alive, and In fact, they see everything as organisms. They see a rock as an organism. They see the universe as an organism. They see a period of history or a war or a city state as an organism, a family. And in each case, what makes it an organism is that it it is it is it has an inner character that determines how it responds to and relates to the world around it. And that inner character is different for every organism. We can trace family ties and see cultural resemblances and so on, but ultimately, on top of that, there is the individuality of one's own experience and distinct mix that makes it so that every person has their own lenses they see the world through. Every family has their own shared set of lenses they see the world through. Every neighborhood, every city state, every culture, every epoch of history, every species has its set of lenses that it sees the world through. And all of these things relate to each other in very sophisticated ways in the ancient worldview. The modern worldview, there's no such thing. None of this is real. We're just machines. We're programmable. But in the ancient worldview, we're not machines at all. We're organisms. And as organisms, we have directions. We have things that we want to do, things that we can't help but notice. We have faculties within ourselves that are in the process of transforming into something different. We're unfolding new order within ourselves and transforming our relationships with everything around us. And this is the nature of the mind and the nature of a worldview according to the ancients. It's very different from the way we see the world as moderns. I'm gonna skim past most of what we've talked about in the previous 2 months. I'm not gonna go back through it. I put a lot of the key terms into the chat. If you see anything in there you have questions about, feel free to ask about it. What the heck is he talking about? But I'm gonna now take us today to bridge back into Kenneth Smith's text from where we left off, and I'm gonna do that through some discussion of essence and arete and teleology and sophrosyne. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what's on my mind is that you really did describing the relationship between understanding or knowledge and existence and being. I wonder since we're all living organisms, including the world itself, then in a sense it sort of evolves and manifests in different ways through times and through relationships and so forth. So the world by its very nature is somewhat ambiguous, which means that we ourselves have to be able to decipher the relationship between the visible and the invisible. And added to that, I wonder to what degree that when the world is sort of somewhat nebulous, I wouldn't say it's totally incomprehensible, but somewhat nebulous. I wonder to what degree by freezing the language more and more to descriptive language that try to really be precise in the measurement of words and so forth, we haven't deviated that relationship between the gray zone and the absolute understanding. And so therefore, in a sense, we could see that the emergence of sophistry is in a sense showing that there is this ambiguity. And in a sense, and I wonder whether the Platonic ideal in this sense is reacting against that ambiguity and say, no, we got to clear it up because, like otherwise we'll never know. But to do so in a sense of further distance ourselves from the very nature of things evolving and changing through time. And so therefore there's a double whammy. So in some sense, it almost increases the sophistry in a sense, because it really even opens up more ways to manipulate the language, because now you have the ambiguity of the world itself, of being itself, and the ambiguity of the language getting more and more complex and complicated. So it creates its own opening in some sense. So this double whammy of emerging from a kind of not, I wouldn't say totally mythic culture that in a sense embody this sort of like, yeah, we're sort of there, but we don't quite understand. Let's remain open to the possibilities, to somehow the measurement of precision. And so, therefore, I wonder, that's why I kept saying that sometimes I wonder if the measurement of truth actually leads to a clearer understanding of whether it actually creates a much more ambiguous relationship. So now when you go, let's say, to court, which makes the last judgment about certain things, since you have no understanding what the guys are saying in some sense, instead of talking in plain language, there's a legal speech. And my sister uh, is a lawyer. She's actually a prosecutor, and I find myself when I talk to her, I have to uh, go into much more poetic and ambiguous language to even deal with her. Otherwise, it's like I'm I'm trapped by the structure of what she's saying. So, in some ways, like, yeah, I wonder whether that double bind doesn't leave us to Jacques Derrida
Yeah.
in some way,
Yeah.
like what we don't even know what that relationship to being is. All we have is the how should I say, the diversity of language itself. So
That's right.
I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, I'm put in mind of the way that when you study traditional Okinawan martial arts, they have all these names for all the different stances, all the different steps, all the different blocks, all the different strikes, all the different things you can do have names. But when you dig into the history, what you discover is none of those names are really Okinawan. Well, the traditional practice didn't name any of these things. You just did the things together. You learned by example. You worked side by side with someone who had mastered this stuff, and you emulated them closely. And then, if they wanted to correct you, they wouldn't say, "Hey, your soto uke, is too far in the blah 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 direction." He would just take your hand and move it over a little. Says maybe more like this, right? You didn't need to name everything, and you'd practice, and you what would happen is over time you would learn to do it right without ever having built up this giant superstructure of words. But the Japanese culture was very different from Okinawan culture. They wanted everything named. They couldn't respect it as a martial art unless everything had names. And in the early 20th century, the Okinawan karate masters were trying to find a way to claw their way out of the economic depression they were in, forced by being colonized by Japan. And they said, you know what? Japan loves intangible cultural assets like martial arts. They love their judo, all these other things that they study. We can make karate look like that, but we have to figure out how to emulate it. And so what they did is they invented names for everything. They started naming all the things that had never been named before. And this giant superstructure of vocabulary that now is quite a chore to study, was invented in the 20th century. People learning today think that you can't do martial arts without having this gigantic, shipload of freight of special terms. But in fact, the only reason we have that is because of an accident of history and
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Miyake.
Right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
thank you. I never fought tree.
Exactly. So what I'm doing here is sort of along those lines, right? I'm throwing all these terms at you, but think of them as scaffolding, not as the purpose of them isn't that the wise Aristos knows all these terms. The wise Aristos understands the world in the ways that these terms are sort of suggesting or hinting at. But and where we're at as moderns, we need these terms to act as a wedge to crack open the shell of our worldview, which prevents us from even looking in those directions. I mean, the ancient worldview of everything as alive and organisms is a non-possibility to us. We don't have any words for it. We don't have any concepts for it. It's not even a blank space. It's a closed up space. Even though it's thousands of years old and it's gigantic and it can explain the whole world, to us, it isn't there at all. And so the purpose of these words is to wedge open and crack open the shell of our worldview and begin to put in place a framework around the invisible thing that we know isn't there, until eventually we start to notice from the framework, geez, it sure seems like this is describing something. Maybe there's something really there, even though it looks invisible to us. Maybe there's a real thing there that the ancients were really looking at that we can't see. And the goal is, once we get to where we can see that, we won't need all these terms, right? The terms should fall away like scaffolding, because now we've finally found the worldview and the ability to look at the world that way. So I mean, I'm really glad you raised what you did. I mean, this goes right to the heart of this thing. And with Kenneth Smith, we're always talking about language and precise, specific definitions that aren't the ones that we're comfortable with from pop culture or modern philosophy. So I'm going to take us on a little arc back from Cornford to Kenneth Smith today. And I ran through a lot in the final half hour last week, so I don't know how much of it, stuck. But some of these basic ideas of, the human character as an organismic structure that involves states of possession. Possession by daimones, where a daimon is a mind. It's a mind that has its own nature, its own character, its own wants and desires, and that human beings, where most animals are congruent with a common shared character that's very strong. And I keep going back to the cheetah because it's so easy to characterize the cheetah. And yes, individual cheetahs will be different from each other. They'll have different personalities, but you can see the common character in any cheetah you meet. It's very pronounced. There's a strong species level character and a smaller individual level character. But what we see in people is just a staggering diversity, right? Across all the time that we know about through archaeology, through anthropology, through comparative studies, even just looking around the world today, we see an enormous diversity that makes it very hard to figure out, what the hell do we have in common? What is this species? And you can see why moderns embrace the idea that there is no there. We are anything. We invent ourselves. We can make ourselves, we're like gods. We can create ourselves anew every day and become whatever we want to be. This is the modern ideology, right? We're completely free. We're not constrained by such messy things as character or nature or an inner lawfulness. I can stop drinking anytime I want to, says my grandma cat who died in the bottle. I mean, she just didn't want to by coincidence every day of her life. She never wanted to stop. But she was sure it was her choice. The concept of a character that constrained her was inconceivable to her, like it is to most moderns. It can't be true. It's a non-thing. And what it means to be in that condition, this is something Kierkegaard's, when Kierkegaard says a delusion is a state of mind in which the thing that you need to think in order to escape the delusion is the very thing that you can't think. The delusion won't let you think that thing. And that's what makes it a delusion, that circularity, that all the tools for escape have been proven away, ruled out, made non-things by the shape of the delusion and the tracks of thinking that it engages us in. This is characteristic of any ideology, and indeed of a worldview. A worldview is an ideology, which is a delusion, but writ on a larger scale. So what the Greeks would say is that, these ideologies and delusions and worldviews, these epochs, are states of possession. They're states of possession. And the reason that they can possess us is that it is in the nature of Homo sapiens to long to be possessed. We are the cultural animal, right? We need to be possessed to finish giving us a character that's capable of developing arete. And without arete, a species can't survive. Arete is the distinctive excellence that suggests the way of life that's going to work in the world for your species. And we don't just have one. There's a whole bunch of possible arete for us. There's a lot of different ways of life that work for Homo sapiens, but we aren't born with any of those things. So the only way that we get them is through the process of acculturation, through mimesis. And so that longing, that urge, that drive to complete ourselves by becoming possessed of a culture or an ideology, right? It's powerful in us. Like the same way the cheetah can't take its eyes off the gazelle. It can't stop looking. We can't stop having that itch for possession. And moderns don't talk about this at all, right? We just say, no, there's no itch. We're not wildly subjective, desperately trying to become possessed. We're objective, rational beings. That's what we are. Sure, sometimes we're contaminated by irrationality, but with enough discipline and education, we can learn not to be irrational, and then we will be, good, mature human beings. This idea that that's gibberish, the whole modern conception of the mind and human character is gibberish. It makes no sense. But the ancient conception not only makes sense, but we see it everywhere around us, including in ourselves every day. It's obviously true. And the only reason we don't see it is that our ideology rules it out as a possibility. So if we look in that direction, we don't see it, and we don't see the gap where it sits. Seems like there's a continuous space in reality that excludes it. It's a absurd and inexpressible idea, to use Kenneth Smith's term for this. So imagine the mind as being, the human mind as being permanently possessed by a character. It's who we are as people is we are in a permanent state of possession from birth to death. And that possession allows us to be alive. That's our soul, or psyche. And the soul is not generic stuff like water, it's specific stuff that has its own character, its own lawfulness, its own details, that are constantly fountaining forth the new order of who we're trying to become, whether we know it or not. Like the child emulating the adult, or practicing throwing rocks at a tree over and over. We're unfolding the new order within us. And the drive to do that comes from our character, which is effective, which they model as a daimon. They model it as a mind that has possessed us. Hi, Ari, welcome to the call. And the core characteristic of the daimon is that it wants to be possessed by other daimones. It wants to be enthused, entheos, to be the God, theos, the God within us. It wants to be enthused with, it wants to feel alive by attaching itself to enthusiasms, like the artist's enthusiasm for art, or the medical practitioner's enthusiasm for medicine, the programmer's enthusiasm. I just, give me another minute here. I can fix it. I know I can fix this program. I'm adding this cool feature that it'll be able to do. It didn't used to do this. Now I've gone in and I've made it do that. I've made something better through the work of my mind and my fingers on the keyboard. That's an enthusiasm. The itch to do that is an enthusiasm. It's a state of possession. And what we all have in common, despite the fact that we're enthused about different things and pursuing different worldviews, is that predilection for entheos, right? It's not just mimesis, it's a drive to be possessed. And that at any given time, we're not possessed by one thing. Nobody's possessed by one thing. We're possessed by thousands of things. Every ideology that we've ever been exposed to possesses us to some extent. Every powerful peak experience in our own parochial lives acts as one of those strange attractors that possesses us and shapes us. Our emotions are states of possession. And as Cornford talks about in Thucydides Mythistoricus, the Greeks tried to catalog the different kinds of states of possession that people could have. If you go to Wikipedia, they will characterize all these minor gods as anthropomorphisms. That's what they call them. So, envy, right? Or attraction, or fear. There's lists of them. You can spend a whole day on Wikipedia clicking from link to link, looking at the lists. But what Wikipedia doesn't understand at all is what these things are. Anthropomorphism is as close as we can come. We say, oh, I see. They failed to understand the world, so they thought everything was gods. Isn't that cute? Those poor primitive proto-scientists, if only they were as smart as we are, they'd know that those things aren't people. But what we fail to understand is that rage is a state of possession. I mean, anyone who's truly been enraged, you gotta think back to the moment when it swelled, the instant when it swelled within you and you became hot and your heart started pounding. I mean, it is the moment. You could put your finger right on the moment when it happens. And the same thing happens if you've never been to the Grand Canyon. You go to the North Rim and you park in the parking lot and you walk down the trail past the little buildings and there's trees and you can't see very much. And then in the course of 4 or 5 steps, suddenly it all comes into view. And you're sitting there staring at the biggest thing you've ever seen in one sight, taking it in all at once. And you can sit there for an hour looking at the details and you realize it's older than you, it's bigger than you, it's more complex than you, and it possesses you, whether for a few seconds or for hours or for the rest of your life, right? And you feel that moment of surprise and awe when it hits you, right? We can think back to moments in our lives where the moment of possession is detectable. Jaw-dropping fall in love attraction. Not everybody's felt it, but those who have felt it, you might remember the time when you were you trailed off and just stared. You lost the capacity for speech. You had been somebody else a moment before, but now you're possessed. And then when the possession came upon you, it interrupted what you were in the middle of doing. People who haven't had that experience, surely you've had the experience where you're having a conversation with somebody and an idea hits you that you haven't thought of before. You have an aha, and you trail off in the middle of your sentence because what you were going to say, which previously was so important to you that it's the one thing you were doing, all of a sudden it doesn't matter at all. You gotta stare at this new idea because you're afraid it'll fly away. You don't want the possession to leave you. You sense that you're in the presence of greatness. There's some cool idea here, but only if you look at it long enough to let it in so that you can feel the shape of it and remember it later, right? That fear when you wake up from a dream and it's an incredible dream, but you're desperate to go back over it in your head so you don't lose it. And how many times did the phone ring or you got distracted by something and then all you could remember afterwards is that you had this amazing dream and now you can't find it again. You've lost the possession, right? It no longer possesses you. So we all know from our own experience this feeling. We've had it multiple times. And the Greeks would say we've had it a lot more often than we think we have. Those are just the peak moments of possession where it's really obvious. What's less obvious to us is all the possessions that happened before we were conscious as people. Somewhere along the line, you start thinking about yourself and your life and philosophy and how does my mind work? And at the time that you're thinking that, you haven't thought like that before. You're thinking with things that already possess you. Every approach to seeing the world or yourself or evaluating whether feelings are good things or bad things, all that stuff, that all got into you through possession. But it got into you when you were so young that you were aphylactos. You were unguarded. You weren't conscious enough to even notice that it was happening at the time. It was just part of the flow of raw experience from infancy, right? Why did the Jesuits say, give us a child until the age of 5 and they're ours for life? Because that's the period of aphylactos. If you can get your ideologies into somebody before they start thinking, then the way they evaluate everything in their lives from there on out is going to be using your toolkit. That's the modern conception, is that this is a toolkit. The ancient conception is that they're going to be using your daimones that you've possessed them with. Because those are the things that are so fundamental to them that they don't know how to question them. Those are the things they would be questioning with. And if you give them the right daimones, those daimones, right, quote unquote, right, those daimones will rule out the capacity to question themselves. They'll have a basic core of hubris that says, I have the right to define reality and myself and God and nature according to the ways that I've been taught. And nobody has the right to make me question those things. If that's your core, you're never going to become philosophical for the rest of your life unless you go through an incredible trauma. Because only if that stuff is dislodged do you have a chance to start asking questions. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, you raised a very interesting conundrum, and I want to explore it in a slightly different way. Quite often we think of people who have fantasies and live in their fantasies as escapists, right? But I wonder to what degree a fantasy is not an idealization about your own vulnerabilities, your own enthusiasm, being overly enthused by life and the world itself, and that could get you into trouble. Let's say you're very enthusiastic about taking mind-altering drugs. And I wonder whether an idealization of something isn't something that, in a sense, not so much a sort of escapism into another world, but to escape in another world so you don't return to that degree of enthusiasm to prevent yourself from being hitched by something that you own handicap. And to what degree is that schism, like to what degree is it that, oh, I just can't deal with life itself, then forget it, I'm just going to fantasize? Or to what degree is kind of like something that plugs a hole in that enthusiasm to a degree, let's say not plug it up completely, but slow the flow of it so that in a sense, you could, in a sense, be more straight in your thinking about what it is, because so much of it is internalized in relationship to the external world. So I wonder whether we have this ability to understand ourselves, understand that we are flawed individuals, and we have to not only watch out for the world, but watch out for ourselves, our own misgivings in a way. So it seems like a fantasy could be a double-edged thing. One, to, in a sense, is completely escape from life itself. One is to protect yourself by taking a fantasy pill. Let's put it that way, in order to just like let's simmer down here, guys, and just like get back to some reasonable balance. Could you say something about that? Because that seemed like a very, very important distinction between external and internal relationships. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Well, I don't think I can do justice to it yet. It's a great question. It is. But I don't think I can do justice to it right now. We'll have to come back to it. I'm glad you said it. We're gonna have to think about it. These are very complex issues we're talking about here. They take some, they're full of implications. And you could spend the rest of your life thinking about them. I mean, the ancients spent 1,000 years, 1,500 years thinking about these things, as a culture, working over and over. Ultimately, I mean, one way to, Sharon's comment in the chat, one learns to tolerate the painful and pleasant present by living in the future, fantasy. Ultimately, there is core to every organism and its survival is a desire to get out of situations of extreme discomfort. It's one of the things that distinguishes a rock from a deer. If the lava starts flowing, the deer's going to run away, but the rock's just going to sit there and get swamped and melt. It can't protect its rockness. It lacks the ability to detect what's going on. It even lacks the ability to care what happens to it. So it's an organism at a very low level, not a zero level. I mean, anybody who's ever accidentally stubbed their toe on a rock understands the rock retains a rockness that is somewhat stubborn, but it lacks that quality we've talked about before of, noticing what's going on in the world and caring. Once you start noticing what's going on in the world and caring, like you rise to the level of an amoeba, then one of the first, especially if you're mobile, I mean, right, all animals share this desire to escape bad situations and move to better situations. It's one of the core meta drives within animals. But what develops in people, and I don't know who else might have this because you'd have to get inside their minds, which we can't do. But within people, we develop this faculty where if we can't physically move out of the discomfort, we cognitively move out of the discomfort. It's something some of the writers after the Holocaust talked about. To what extent do you have to create a safe space in your mind when you're in a concentration camp to permit you to remember, regardless of what the perverse incentives and pressures around you are trying to turn you into, you can create a safe space to remind yourself, who do I want to be? Who am I trying to, what are the better angels of my nature? And then you can translate and figure out, how much of that can I find some way to bring to life, even under these dire circumstances. So this kind of escapism versus immersion in reality is complicated because we can use escapism in order to retain touch with reality. And let me tell you, that's a paradoxical trick, right? But we do that all the time, right? And I think the reason that we have that capacity and can do that is that it builds directly off this core feature of Homo sapiens that we need to acculturate. I mean, all states of possession are a form of escape. It's just that some of the forms of escape lead us into a healthier relationship with the world, and others lead us into a sicker relationship with the world. This is kind of why I'm like, you've raised interesting stuff here, Phil. I'm gonna be just like when Joe brought up agency versus contingency 6 months ago, and I've been harping on it ever since. I'm gonna come back to your point over and over and be thinking about it and chewing on it. So thank you for that. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, hello everyone. Welcome everyone. It's so nice to be here. Immediately loving the discussion about how these daimons possess us. And an author some of you may be familiar with, Yuval Harari, talks about this anthropological mystery of how humans discovered agriculture, and then were basically possessed, or I would use the word a little differently. I like the idea of saddled by it, meaning that it puts a yoke on us. And the strange thing that he points out that's a normal, apparent, accepted position in anthropology is that human beings led happier, more rich, full lives as hunter-gatherers with significantly less disease, working maybe between 10 and 20 hours a week on average as a person in relatively productive environments, not overpopulating, not dealing with a lot of difficulties. And then once we discovered agriculture, and wherever agriculture was, it completely subsumed and saddled, or in this case, possessed whatever group of people it encounters. That becomes the way of life. And it's this question is like, why would we enter into a more miserable state of existence? Why is this at all? If human beings really are this rational being, which I don't buy into at all, but if you pretend we are and we're choosing our level of happiness, why would we go to, in this video game of life, to something that's less pleasurable? And this is more speaking to this idea that I like, that's almost, I'm not sure how well accepted it is, but it's this idea here that these things, these ideas or other people that we interact with, the idea of themselves as a self, or the ideas themselves in terms of agriculture, is living. And it's some sort of relationship we form with them where we become entangled and we can't disentangle, that we can't push off this possession, where now it's not that we, if you look at it this way, it's not that we so much subjugated wheat. It's more like wheat subjugated us. And if you look at tribes and societies, rather, human beings will put themselves through horrible experiences just to keep the wheat alive, right? As opposed to, oh, we'll just let the wheat die and go back to the forest. Like, no. Humans will suffer horribly and do horrible things to each other just to keep the wheat alive. It looks like it's become our god. And in this case, it really resembles this idea of a small god, or maybe even a large god, depending on you want. But you take this forward through time. Yuval Harari points out that this is what technology and mythology and ideology do over and over to us. And they do battle within societies as cultures, and whichever idea is more successful, that's going to be the culture that's more successful. And then that will dominate the other cultures it destroys or interacts with. And these ideas in the forms of technology generally procreate and then take over that other society, meaning like the scientific method, capitalism, technology in general, but specifically we see it in anthropology through agriculture. Agriculture is the way of the world, and there's no going back. There's no separating ourselves. It's almost like we're in this 0 to 5-year-old Jesuit state where now we're all agriculturists. None of us are going back. And it's something along the lines of we believe and assume that we can't live without it. And we can't live and love without our internet or our automobiles. These structures, to some degree, have saddled us. And I would argue it's interesting because it looks like maybe the wheat is saddling us, but it's more like we're in a spaceship together flying through outer space where we need each other. The spaceship and the people can't exist without the other. We've become an organism that's both people and technology and these things. We're like a combined, entangled, simultaneity sort of thing that you can't separate. And at the same time, there's no going backwards. And unlike some of these ideas, like you get angry or you have an aha moment or you fall in love, I also distinctly remember moments where I'm with a person and they say something to me and that love is gone. You're like, oh, you said something, you revealed something about yourself that I don't want to interact with you ever again. Right? It's this kind of thing. The love dies. And it's interesting that I guess to some degree ideas have this too with people, like, like none of us worship the Greek gods in Olympus now because we think there's a better model of reality that matches up. Maybe with bringing into the model of the ancients, we include them as a pantheon or a panel of things, right? But they all coexist and there is a hierarchy to some degree based on things. And I find that that's really that's the good point that I wanted to bring out. This idea of they saddle us. And this is a process of evolution that happens through humanity itself. That's it. That's good.
Thank you, Ari. That's great. Yeah, and add a couple of things to just reinforce what you're saying, because I think you're right on. And more importantly, we're reading Kenneth Smith's book. I think you're right on with what Kenneth Smith would say. The saddling in particular, when he first explains ethos anthropoi daimon, Heraclitus's character's fate, he says, that the Greeks imagined the daimon riding on your shoulders, and that it's ultimately the origin of the expression, you've got a monkey on your back. It means, what if instead of having a benevolent guardian angel overseeing your affairs, you instead are being, governed by an idiot that's constantly nudging you towards, appetites. This idea that he has, that he explains when he's explaining the ancient conception of the daimon, he says it's not just a rider, although it is that, and that's why the saddle example is great. It's an expert rider. He's not having to beat you and hit you, because if he did that, you'd be aware you're ridden. And we think that we're not. While we're in the state of possession, we imagine we're free. Grandma Pat thought she could put down the bottle any old time she wanted to, but she couldn't. But she didn't know it. She couldn't distinguish the possession from genuine freedom. They look the same to her. And that's how the possession works. It affects your wants. It affects what you notice and pay attention to and desire. And then you mistake the possession's desires for your desires. And because that's the structure of our psyche. We can't tell them apart. And so, he says, when a daimon is riding you, it's not riding you like a clumsy bad rider. It's riding you like an expert rider. And the nudges are so subtle that you think you were the one that decided to go left or go right or jump over the fence. When the horse and the rider, they're like one organism when they have a long, beautiful, deep experience with each other. They lose track of whose actual desires are at work here. I think those are great metaphors, Ari. And part of what's interesting for understanding the ancient worldview and what Kenneth's trying to say, those are very useful. And part of what's important here is that this is such an anti-modern idea. And where you can see it the most is with the concept of an idea. Moderns think ideas are tools or possessions. I have an idea. I have it. It sits on the shelf, my shelf. And it doesn't do anything until I want to use it. This is the modern computer-based mind conception of an idea. Ideas are passive, we're active, and we decide when the idea comes into play. We say there might be exceptions now and then for interesting blurry areas, but generally speaking, we're in charge and they're passive. But the Greek conception is the opposite. Everything's an organism, even an idea, even the mind. So when we're asleep at night or not paying attention, the ideas aren't sitting on a shelf. They're growing. They're making relationships with other ideas and with our feelings and our memories. They burrow into our minds and create these vast networks of tunnels, linking things together without us ever deciding that we wanted to use the ideas like that. From the ideas perspective, we're just an ecosystem it happens to inhabit. We're not the master that tells it when it's allowed to think things. It's going to think things whether we like it or not. And it really changes our understanding of the definition of what does it mean to be a self? Who am I? Well, it's like the people who have to come to terms with the fact that, you know, I'm not even a bunch of cells that all have the same DNA. What's in my gut? First of all, there's more cells in my gut than there are in all the rest of my body put together. And those cells are bacteria and archaea. They don't have my DNA. They're as alien to me as it's possible to get on the planet Earth and be a living organism. But without them, I die. And when they're sick, I get depressed or I start having B vitamin shortages or God knows. I mean, they do all kinds of things for us. It takes a while to get comfortable with the idea. And I think most moderns never do, to get comfortable with the idea that the self is not an individual. The self is an ecosystem. And there's stuff moving around in there without our permission all the time. Our brain is not in charge. It's along for the ride like our hand or our stomach. It is a participant, not the god of the self. And so the Greeks just take that a step further by saying, yes, then the same is true of ideas and feelings and, you know, worldviews, perspectives. They are also daimons that possess us. And they've got their own goals for what their own teleology, their own telos for how they want to shape the world. That is, I mean, separate's not the right word, but to some extent separate from what we imagine our own goals to be. And there's thousands of them in here, and they're all pulling in their own directions. When their directions line up together, they can be a powerful force in our mind. The whole time with us thinking it was our idea and not theirs. You know, this is a different way of expressing Jung and Freud's concept of the unconscious. The unconscious isn't just some stuff you have that you're not aware of. The unconscious is the whole ecosystem that's all busily doing things while you think that it's not. It's knowing things and thinking things and so forth without your permission. States of possession. This is the ancient conception. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I like that, Rick. Thanks. So if the mind is an ecosystem for the thriving of all these ideas that captivate us, it seems like certain religious rituals where they take drugs offers a kind of maybe a line of escape, from that ecosystem of ideas, and these possessions are they're like you're saying, they're we're organisms, and these ideas are organisms. So they're basically forms of life, right? We're possessed by forms of life. And there could be forms of life that help us to thrive, and others that capture us and make us their victims. And I think some of the, if that's the case, but I think for us, ideas as forms of possession, and they're also forms of life. That's what we're mostly involved in, right? We're always involved in some language game, and that's a big powerful tool that could capture us and make us its victim. So yeah, I kind of like that idea, and that's
Thanks, James.
So would you say that the any kind of idealism, which could be interpreted as the kind of hubris, or a extreme skepticism, would be taking out of your zone of moderation. With this sophrosynia would be a kind of moderation, of the middle ground between these two extremes of idealism and maybe doubt or skepticism. Whereas, if you're to be healthy and to be most free from these kind of possessions would be kind of like living in a zone of moderation, like in the everydayness of life, that you recognize that you are always involved in some kind of a language game, some kind of possession, and you recognize that.
Yes.
Because we can't help but be involved in some kind of language game.
Right.
And even philosophy could be a language, is a language game. That could be a possession. And I think that's what Wittgenstein recognized and kind of developed his whole notion of that. Even philosophizing takes you out of that zone of moderation, where you see the reality of that you're playing some kind of language game, and it's only a game. We learned it, and then we get lost in it and develop into a kind of fantasy that captivates us. So what do you think about
that? Yeah, that's a lot of good stuff there, James. And the language game aspect is certainly true, except the only part of it that we might maybe not emphasize is the word game. Because for us, acculturation is life or death. It may not be our arete, because we don't just have one arete, but it's certainly our meta arete that makes all our other arete possible. The fact that we are so mimetic and acculturable. There's a word there somewhere we need to find. So this thing is a need in us, not just a mistake. We can't ever develop into the full mature adult form of Homo sapiens unless we go through the process of acculturation, and that requires, among other things, the medium of language. Now, that doesn't mean that all use of language is healthy, right? Because of course we've got that problem. Where does health lie? And that's what all of today is about. Is we're pulling our terms together to get back to Sophrosune, and Sophrosune is all about: do you have the compass to know where your health lies, where your vitality lies? The other part of what you said that I'd like to riff on just a moment before I call on Stephen is this: the middle ground. Aristotle's golden mean and the modern conception of the golden mean are worlds apart from each other. Aristotle's very clear that, for each virtue, he talks about that the virtue lies between an excess and a deficiency, too little and too much, and that the proper space that you're aiming for, the golden mean between those extremes, is almost never in the middle. He says it might be in the middle, but it might be more to one side or the other. And in some cases, it might be almost all the way to one side of too much and too little. And he says, and moderns occasionally will note that with puzzlement and then move on and go back to thinking of it as moderation and centrism. That's why moderation is a dangerous term to use in translating the golden mean. But it's because the way he's deciding where the mean should be is not based on mathematics. And to us, that's puzzling. What do you mean? Give us the abstract system that gives us the answers so that we can thoughtlessly become puppets of our systems of thinking. I don't want to actually have to put myself at risk here by having to, creatively judge. But of course, he says you have to creatively judge. The reason you have to creatively judge is we lack Sophrosune. We don't know where health and vitality are. But the golden mean is located where health and vitality is. Somewhere between too much and too little. Maybe mostly on one side or the other, maybe anywhere in between, somewhere is vitality. And that's where the golden mean is located. But we don't even have a word for Sophrosune in English, let alone the ideas. It's one of those inexpressible surds, because if there were healthier and less healthier ways of life that lead to the development or failure to develop arete, that would constrain us. And moderns don't want to be constrained. More than anything, we want the green light. We want to be free. And we've taken that to the extreme of free from sanity, free from health, free from all rational constraint, all, especially free from all irrational constraint. We don't want to adopt a constraint unless we can say that it was rational. So, I mean, I agree with everything that you're saying, James. I just want to emphasize Aristotle's particular interpretation of the golden mean, which is sophra sune. That's what's determining where it is that we're supposed to be aiming on these things.
Yeah, instead of some moderation zone between two extremes, could we think of it as a kind of the idea that there's no internal or external point of reference, that it is that it is both, or neither internal or external. Because if you're saying that we are like a ecosystem, and we are always in touch with the milieu, with the environment that we're in, so there's no really an inner and an outer, is there? I mean, we're just part of that entire system, the ecosystem, and we are just an organism within that. So there is no inner and outer, is there?
I mean, that's exactly the right question. This is I spent some time this morning putting together kind of how our bridge back to Kenneth's text would work, and it goes through the very questions you're asking, which is, why is it that the cheetah knows which way is north? And I don't mean north, but it knows where its vitality and health lies as a species. And by know, I don't mean that it could write an essay about it or could give a dissertation, but rather that it can't stop thinking about the things that it's supposed to be thinking about. And I'll be talking about that, the sick cheetah and the healthy cheetah, in a little bit. But the problem for Homo sapiens is that there isn't a single proper ethea for us, a single proper way of life. There are multiple possible good ethea for us, and each one has its own arete, and we're not born with any of them. We have to be acculturated into that way of life before we can start to develop that arete, or as part of the process of developing that arete. And so our need for mimesis sets the table to get us started, but then we don't start cooking until we acculturate. And the result is, it isn't because there's a potentially enormous number of healthy ways of life, it was impossible for evolution to give us the same biological compass that a cheetah has, because the cheetahs all have one arete. And so they can be born into that sophra sune, that awareness of a single direction, but we aren't, so we can't be. And the absence of the compass means that, for every one of these virtues, with the somewhere between an excess and a deficiency, somewhere in there is a point that's more important than all other points for any given way of life. But none of us gets to feel where that is. And so we're always guessing. We might rationalize our guesses and have explanations, but we're always guessing. And so when you talk about the lack of an internal or external, awareness, that's right on the money. So we really are lost at sea in trying to figure out at a fundamental, not just because we're moderns, but at a fundamental biological level, the thing that made us so smart and creative did it by making us lost at sea, and made us desperately hungry for acculturation that would answer that fundamental question. Where should I be going? What am I supposed to be doing? And that ache, evolution gave us that ache. And it's the driver for acculturation. It's great questions. And we're going to come back to that for the rest of today's session. Stephen, what's on your mind?
I was looking at Goethe's work, Faust, a bit. Of course, this is a sort of a classic tale of possession. And Goethe put his own spin on it. And there's that passage where Faust gets a bit uppity and decides he can retranslate the Bible. And, he says, in the beginning was a word. What nonsense is that? Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. In the beginning was a thought. Nah. In the beginning was that power. Okay. in the beginning was the deed. This sort of reminds me of Karl Marx's famous quotes. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways till now. The point, however, is to change it. Now, I've looked at the word, and I'm not the world's greatest scholar, but I get a feeling a proper translation for the word might be the message, understanding. You're given a story. The first thing somebody might say, well, you come into an environment, the first thing is to read it, to understand what's going on before you act. But dear old Carl has decided he knows everything. He knows the score, and he's going to act. He doesn't need to believe that there's any further understanding to come across. I suppose where in the beginning was the thought, well, you could put Hegel in that category, maybe. Goethe, I was looking at Essential Salts video on Goethe and Hegel, and Goethe was very critical of Hegel. And, well, in the beginning was the power, you know, you got Max Stirner and Nietzsche. They, well, you know, were maybe Schopenhauer, in the beginning was the will, it's the power. And then in the beginning was the deed, which is actually the end. There's no beginning there. That's actually the end of a process. And so, yeah, it's where do we go from starters when we stop reading the message and then we become possessed by an idea which might not have an adequate relationship with reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's a great overview. And you know, I was reading, I'm reading some Ken Stanley Robinson science fiction solarpunk novels right now. And he occasionally has characters talk about Marx. And one of the summaries that one of them gave is Marx as a historian is pretty interesting, but Marx as a prophet is dismal. When it's predicting the future is, you know, a fool's game. That's, you know, somebody's fallen for their own foolishness when they start to say, I have seen the future, allow me to explain it to you. This is what Sharon was pointing out earlier about there's a certain escapism into the kind of fantasy life in thinking that the future is as clear as the present. And this is something that Cornford talks about in Thucydides Mythhistoricus. He also points out that Thucydides talks about it, and Thucydides has the Spartan generals talk about it when they're talking to the Athenians and saying the reason that the ancient worldview says that you must be magnanimous in victory and be skeptical about your own good fortune is nobody knows the future. The worst thing that can happen for a Homo sapiens is to mistake the future for the present and to think that you see it as clearly as it actually is. So that is not the zone in which we get to make those kind of pronouncements. But as you point out, Steve, there's an inverted version of that, which is in the beginning was, and you know, the wisdom of tragedy is we begin in the middle. We don't know where the beginning was. If Oedipus knew the beginning of his story, none of these horrible things would have happened to him, right? It's because he doesn't know. He's mortal. He doesn't get to know until it's too late what was in the beginning. But you find, just like you find an endless line of prophets in history who are like, I'm like a god and you should listen to me and I'm going to tell you how it is. You find an endless series of theogonists who are like, in the beginning was the void, and then the great egg hatched, and from it came love. And you know, it's like, you don't know any of those things. You don't know if any of that's true. You weren't there. I wasn't there. It could all be literally true, and you're still wrong to say it because you don't know if it's true or not. The hubris of the act, right? Homo sapiens, the hubris of the act of declaiming on how it all started or how it's all going to end. you'd think after thousands of years of tragedy and comedy and debacles, we'd have learned our lesson not to do that stuff. To just say, I'm not sure how it started. Here's some models. I don't know which one is real. It might be none of them. And I'm not sure how it's going to end. Here's some models. I don't know which one's right or if any of them is right. We'll just make our way as best we can, as though we are fallible mortals who only know a certain amount. It was a good capsule summary of a bunch of the major positions. And you're right, they're so confident. It's almost it's like, was that the 19th century? Is that the signature? Is that how you know it's a 19th century writer? That there is this astonishing confidence. This is how it began. This is how it will end. Is it, buddy? Is that true? I'm not,
Well, luckily we have Jordan Peterson to persecute Marx today.
Yay.
Unleash the Jordan.
Unleash the Jordan. So, states of possession, right? So last time I during the final half hour, I was sort of rapidly summarizing things. And one of the things was eudaimonia, which people literally translate as having a good character, right? Or a good fate, or a good outcome, or being lucky. Eudaimonia means you lucked out. This is what astrology was originally for. It wasn't to predict the future, is to say, what kind of character are you born with? Are you born with a character that's going to go well for you, or are you born with a character that's going to go poorly for you? We've lost track of that as being the reason, of course. But that was what the goal was originally. And it was ultimately like throwing dice. They were just, whatever the stars happen to be, we'll just conclude, what the story of your life's going to be. It was people escaping into the fantasy of knowing character. And Heraclitus warns us, you can't fully know your character. You spend your whole life exploring all of its pathways and you'd never get to the end of it. It's going to be full of surprises. That's what you can say about your character. Is just like there's an infinity around you, there's an infinity within you. You can learn parts of it and start to draw tentative conclusions and start to try to cultivate things that you've detected are a problem. But you're never going to know it the way that Poseidon knows the sea. That's just not going to happen. And you're not going to know it the way the medieval god of Genesis knows the universe into existence through his will. And any mortal attempt to emulate those things. And this is a thing that I loved the Greek myths as a kid, but I always hated those myths where some mortal is doing some perfectly reasonable thing, seemed to me, and the gods just suddenly come down and punish them. Like, Arachne with her beautiful weaving. And here comes Athena to kick her ass for daring to say that she weaves better than Athena. Well, how cruel of that goddess to come pick on that good weaver. You've deprived the world of a great weaver just so you could have spiders. And what I didn't understand was the flaw of hubris, right? I was at the age where hubris is that's all I've got. When you're immersed in the flow of reality, you take everything as exactly what it is. Hubris is 100% of your game, right? Everything is, if you feel angry, things are bad. If you feel happy, things are good. There's just an exact equation between your feelings and perceptions on the one hand and how things are on the other. So I was in no way prepared to understand what a trap hubris is. I couldn't understand that the problem was not that she said she was as good a weaver as Athena. It's not that she offended Athena. It's that she blundered badly by mistaking the quality of weaving that a mortal is capable of with the quality of weaving that the sacred is capable of. Because the sacred weaves the entire cosmos. And when have you seen a person weave the entire cosmos? Never. That's when you've seen that. Never. And you never will. And that was the mistake that Arachne was making. I thought it was because she shot her mouth off and got too cruel a punishment for a moment of, slipped tongue. But that's because it wasn't just my youth, but I was so saturated by modernity that the concepts of the enormous divide between the mortal realm and the sacred realm, and the absolute importance of not confusing the two with each other, this was lost on me. I was not ready to hear anything like that. I was just offended. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this thing about not knowing the future is somewhat problematic in some sense. Obviously, we don't know the future, but I wonder whether we don't have a kind of flashlight in a sense we could see partially into the future, because all we have is the possible relationship between the past and the future. And I wonder whether something like probability theories are not a tool that we have in terms of, let's say, having some inkling of what the future is, rather than an absolute relationship. So I wonder probability, how does it match possibilities? Because otherwise we might as well just stand still. I'm not I'm not moving from this spot, man, because I have no idea what it is. I'll wait 10 years, then I'll move up 10 years. I mean, that would seem very frustrating. So does the relationship between the present and the past and the future, does it have this sort of gradual creeping along cautiously, or does it really manifest itself that things go slowly and then all of a sudden, I mean, like it falls off the cliff? There is the edge of the earth, and you're going to fall off the cliff. It seems like you're making steady progress, but suddenly everything happens and you fall off the cliff. I mean, the fact that the world is round, maybe we now don't have to worry about falling off the cliff in that sense. But I wonder, because it does seem like, what's his name, the American writer says, things always happen slowly, then all of a sudden. And it's all of a sudden that's going to like catch you, no matter how cautious you are, because you're being very cautious and you're not losing, you're creeping across. Everybody's saying, hey, you slowpoke, walk faster. And you said, no, you're doing fine. But all of a sudden, it's like even that catches you being very, very cautious. So how does that work in terms of, because we're not like the cheetah, although all of a sudden probably catch cheetah too. So we have to, in a sense, depend on ability of a mind to at least sense something, or mind and our feelings, in a sense, to sense something. Otherwise, like I said, standing still is absolutely the best thing there is. I'm not moving on this spot. And that would seem very, very odd as well. So things change, like I remember, like, now I actually don't have a cell phone, and my nephew says, everybody in the third world has a cell phone. I said, well, I live in the fourth world, and that explains it. But now it just seems like everywhere I go now that has something I have to deal with, whether it's another commercial thing or whatever it is, you have to register. You have to have a cell phone. I keep trying to explain to them, I do not have a cell phone. I just have an email, right? But is that you got to give me a cell phone, because otherwise the structure doesn't work in our system. So I said, well, look, I'll give you a lie, a cell phone, a phone that I used to have, but it's defunct. It's been defunct for 5 years, but you have to have one. So you're not even allowed to be in the system if you don't have one. I mean, it's become so pervasive that even if you think you could do without it, it's like, well, at least I have an email. So in some sense, but I have to explain it. And if I try to explain it to a robot, they just don't understand. They repeat again, we don't understand. I finally then able to get a human being on, and they kind of understand. They probably don't approve, but they kind of understand. Okay, yeah, right. Okay, so in some sense, I have to find another human being who actually could understand why I don't have a cell phone. It's like, so that just seems, we're just trapped in a system that we can't even operate without the required equipment to operate. It's so mandatory. It's kind of like what I already said about agriculture. I mean, it might have worked in the very beginning, but now, with the population it is, you abandon agriculture, billions of people is going to die. I mean, we're just trapping the system. Well, you said, well, maybe not me. I'm okay. So, but nonetheless.
What you said puts me in mind of that famous Zen koan, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And it's like, we think that the purpose of wisdom is to make it so that we don't have to do work anymore. And if that's not what wisdom is going to give us, what the hell is the point of it? And of course, the Zen koan's saying, well, the point of wisdom isn't to make life easier. It's to understand what the hell we're doing, and to be able to make better choices. But those choices don't include leaving out the things that are necessary for life. This is the sophrosune part, right? It's like there are other things that before enlightenment and after enlightenment might change a great deal. The things that you were doing that are making life sick for yourself and others, you might change those after enlightenment. But the core stuff, without which you don't even have a thea, a way of life, that stuff's not going to change if you're pointed in the right direction. Now, in some ways, you can see that this is a historical koan, because it dates back to when a larger percentage of our lives were spent doing healthy things. Not so much of it was these sick enthusiasms, which we'll come to and on. But these are tricky issues. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey guys, love to hear about Phil and how he is thrown off the yoke of his saddle. He is a wild horse and is not being ridden by his cell phone. I am definitely a slave to my cell phone, but I also, at least in this case, I only let my rider be on my back a certain amount of hours. I try to limit my cell phone use to like 1 or 2 hours a day, and I don't use it for anything other than like reading the news, kind of like a virtual newspaper or talking to people, something that I would used to do, and it's just more convenient. But something that I wanted to spring up that was very nice about Phil, so nice. Like if we didn't have anything to predict the future, we'd just sit around and do nothing like rocks, we'd be rocks. Right. So this is in neuroscience. This is the idea that the brain is a Bayesian brain, which is a predictive engine based on modeling through probabilities. And the simple idea that is actually pretty complex and profound, I'll just introduce it, is in math. It sounds like a totally different thing, but I think it's actually how you describe it in information theory. So buckle up. I'll try to be quick and simplified enough that when we predict the future, there are actually only 2 types of numbers. There are what we call countable infinities and uncountable infinities. And this is in set theory, straight up to like super crazy math. And predictable infinities are really actually nice and easy when you have a certain metaphor. Predictable infinities of the sun rises every day. The Bayesian brain relates to that. And that's very useful for in every season turn, right? Now we know when to plant, know when to harvest, and you couple it with the moon. Now you got a bunch of stuff that's really useful for living better, albeit under the saddle of agriculture, under the saddle of a sun and a moon. But these tools, we use them to better predict the future. And the idea is when we bring in a tool like a cell phone or something, we should be asking ourselves as a society, which we're not. Like you were saying, we have the hubris, we're just locked in. But if we didn't, we'd be like, is this a mythology about a story of the Big Bang or whatever? Is that going to be useful for predicting our future? And if the answer is no, we should discard it. And the answer is yes, then we should make it useful. But instead, it seems to be more like they make us useful versus us making them useful. And the point is, like, how much am I using my cell phone? Is that useful for me to predict my future and make better decisions? Oh, there's my son wants to say hi. And he's just getting his toys. And so the idea is very nicely with Phil is what are we predicting and why? And this idea, something that comes back to these fantasies and whether they're useful for dealing with pain, something I wanted to bring up very much like this in sort of the infinities and whatnot, is the idea of what Nietzsche would call is we are able to bear almost any what for a single why. And this is the idea of a quest. Let's say you've got a holy grail that you're going to go after. Well, my reason for being is that mission, and I'm able to handle any sort of negativity or a difficult situation, even a concentration camp, if it's going to allow me to get to the grail. right? It just becomes the next chapter in my exciting story. And I can turn these very negative things into something positive. I can take something with negative valence where I feel it's bad and it's negative. But if I see it in the framework of my quest, and I have passion and I have a will to power, whatever, so to speak, about that, I can use these as hurdles in my race. And then a hurdle is just an excitement, a form of thing that will allow me to get stronger, albeit it's a difficult action item to handle. Once I've handled that challenge, now I'm a greater hero in my own story, right? And I get to the next level in the video game. I mean, a lot of our processes have these built in where we're doing things that are difficult for the sake of something we want. And this is what the key is here for the Bayesian brain, is if we're going to create a fantasy, which is just a prediction, an imaginary future, we're going to try and predict, is that able to, and how much is that? And then it gets tricky because you've got the internal world, which is, you don't know your character, you don't know your beginning or end. That's an uncountable infinity. I don't know if the sun rises for me every day internally and what that sun looks like. There's a whole confusing, I don't even know if I have suns, right? It's so confusing. I don't have these fixtures inside of me to predict. So it gets very messy and it gets very confusing. And the sun for us that rises every day is the quest. And then perhaps the actions or experiences that we have, or then maybe the tools we allow ourselves to be saddled by, right? These are all fixtures for the Bayesian brain to move forward and feel, to some degree, I guess, things we want to feel and experience. Yeah, that's me. I'm good.
Thanks, Ari. Yeah, it's an interesting model. It's not the ancient model, but it's an interesting model. You can see with this kind of ancient model built around states of possession that rather than predictions, they see it as more focused on obsessions. And they were trying to invent rationality as a discipline, and they didn't, as they were doing it, they saw it as many virtues being attached to it. You can find a great deal of writing in classical Greek philosophy in which rationality is seen as a solution to many of the problems of society. But this is because they hadn't yet discovered the other half of the problem. They discovered desire as a problem, but they hadn't discovered ideology as a problem. And it's a minority of Greek philosophers who are going, wait a minute, I'm not sure rationality always leads to virtue. It seems to be more complicated than that. And this is part of what Thucydides is doing, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, is he's going, hey, I thought this was Athens. How come, if Athens is trying to be so rational, why are they doing these scary self-destructive things? The critiques of sophists that you see in Plato and elsewhere are of the same kind of nature of, wait a minute, maybe we were mistaken. Maybe it's not all about just being as rational as we can. So at first they were focused on modeling states of obsession, with an eye towards parochialism and appetites and, these enthusiasms like rage or the desire for revenge or what have you. And they were seeing those as problematic because they disrupted rationality. But as you get into the more sophisticated Greek philosophers, they're starting to see even ideas and ideologies can be obsessions. And that's when they start to have a problem, because now you can't just call the good thing that you're striving for reason or rationality, because ideologies are perfectly reasonable and rational. It's just that they're dysfunctional. They lead towards destruction. And so Aristotle's really doing us a service by trying to get us to focus more on the ancient virtue of sophrosune. He's trying to drive a wedge. I'm going to use this term again, like I did earlier. He's trying to break up the previously accepted ancient worldview that rationality is what we should be striving for as our way of dealing with, irrationalisms. This isn't the mythic, but this is the logos ancient culture. He's trying to break that up and say, actually, there's something more fundamental than rationality that's more important than rationality. And it would include rationality as a subset on a leash of the mind's activities if it were healthy. Just like it would, we're not saying you shouldn't have feelings, you shouldn't have parochial experiences, but we're saying those things should serve the greater mind, not be the whole of the mind. And it should be on a leash. They should both be on a leash, and they should be correcting each other. So that when my ideology says, maybe if I purify my country by exterminating everybody who's impure, then our country will be healthy. It's like, wait a minute, that bears no resemblance to reality. Perfectly logical, rational, but divorced from reality. So, let's check our ideas based on actual experience so that we don't have to, become slaves to ideologies like Hannah Arendt critiques the Nazis and Stalinism and so on. So the predictive part is part, would they, their ancients would say that's part of the mind. It's part of the mind. But the challenge for us from the sort of Aristotelian perspective, the challenge is that there are things that need to be thought if we are to be sane and healthy, but that you may never experience directly a reason to think that it's true or real. And you may never be able to reason your way to proving that it's real or true or vital, but it remains true and real and vital, despite the fact that you can't get there from either of the sort of half-mind approaches that we're all subject to. So we'll come back to this. But thanks for bringing that up. James, what's on your mind?
Yeah, thanks. So are you saying that this idea of rationality as a kind of possession, are you referring to Platonic rationality? And is that a kind of possession that takes you out of the world of experience and positing a kind of infinite world of that is something different? And the idea of infinity, is that part of your motto of a possession that you're describing for the Greeks, that is supposed to be healthy? And isn't it the idea of infinity kind of like can be a possession that takes you out of the reality of life? And so is it necessary, to have this kind of idea of infinity? Of course, that's maybe another form of deluding ourselves to think that we can, predict the future as if we can see beyond the finite world. And but in modern times, in modern days, we do have a kind of our instruments are kind of predictive of the future, right? You have a GPS, and you can put your destination in a GPS, and you can predict based on a GPS, you're going to get there in the future, within an hour or 2 hours or 6 hours, and that's the kind of prediction that is pretty reliable.
Yeah.
But once you start going into, beyond that, beyond the world of the finite world of geography and organic life and so forth, then it becomes questionable whether it's that prediction can be reliable or not. It becomes a possession, right?
Yeah. These are, again, fantastic questions, James. So, yeah, obviously we're saying that, it's not that the future is 100% unknowable. It's not that it's 100% knowable, and it's not that it's 100% unknowable, but it's somewhere in between. We have the exact same problem with this that we have with identifying where the virtue lies between the extremes of too little and too much of some quality. Somewhere in there is the right course, but we lack the compass to tell us where's the spot. And so we try to come up with cheats. I mean, an ideology is a cheat, right? It's an attempt to reduce the complexity of the world down and say, well, this will always work. So I'm going to stop thinking about it, and I'm just going to plug in my variables and get my answer. And then I will just always do what the answer is, regardless of how bad it looks. Next thing you know, Stalin's setting up gulags and exporting all of his critics to Siberia, even though some of the things he does need to be criticized and he needs to hear it. But by excluding everybody, now he's creating a bubble in which the worst impulses are being reinforced, and you get a spiral of bad behavior. Now there's all kinds of ways in which we try to oversimplify. So rationality in Homo sapiens is a basal faculty of the metabolism of the mind. We've got two basal faculties, what we might call gnosis and what we might call noesis, where gnosis is that being deeply, as much as possible, immersed in the flow of experience of life. We pay attention to what we're seeing, we pay attention to what we're feeling, what we remember. We're just plugged in like a live wire. And it's an important faculty, but it's not the only one we have. It becomes an obsession or a possession when we adopt the ideology that says we don't need to be rational. We just need to live authentically every moment of our life. That's what turns it into an ideology, and that creates problems. Then it sets us up to be possessed by experiential, because we've decided that there can't be any demonisms. This is the source of all virtue, and we must obey it implicitly. What we see in the modern world is less often that. Those people don't tend to thrive. We tend to give them Darwin Awards for locking themselves into safes and things like that.
Wait, Rick, Rick, I want to
Instead,
ask, could you, those two terms you just said, I don't like to interrupt, but this is really good. What were those two terms? Just as the geonosis and I'm sorry, I
gnosis
missed.
and noesis.
If you just
Gnosis and
write them in the
noesis.
chat, I will, yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I would like to look them up for study.
Yeah, what you're going to find is that moderns define them in all kinds of different ways, and even the ancients defined them in a variety of ways. But here they're being used in a very specific philosophical way. And gnosis is being used as the term that means being plugged into experience. It's the faculty of our mind that allows us to immerse ourselves in what we're seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling, what we feel inside ourselves, our emotions, our memories. It is the way of life in us that is the least abstract and the most concrete, because it's the most plugged into what's actually happening. The other faculty in us, noesis, is the other extreme, and we usually develop it out of our dissatisfactions with gnosis. And noesis is the abstracted intellectual life. We learn logic, we learn math, we learn the law, we learn how the economy works. We become interested in systems of thinking that think for us and tell us when our thinking is valid and not valid. And we want to use those systems to draw all of our conclusions about what's real and what's not real. And when we do that, this is Hegel's critique of these two faculties. When we do that, when we fall for it, what happens is we begin to see abstraction as a virtue and concreteness as a vice. We see objectivity as a virtue and subjectivity as a vice. And we start to mistake ourselves for angels of reason who can dispassionately disgorge objective truth as though we're oracles, none of which is true. Noesis creates the space for planning and learning and abstracting by distancing itself from gnosis. Like if you're trying to study for your law finals, you can't have all kinds of noise in your apartment and people running around and partying and having sex on the chair next to you. And it's like, for the love of God, get out. I need a quiet space in which to rearrange myself into this new abstracted form that knows all of these things. So noesis has a tendency to turn into an ideology. This is just like gnosis can turn into an ideology. Noesis can turn into sort of a state of possession in which you decide all good things come from calm rationality and all bad things come from subjectivity. This is probably the most widespread vice among the ruling class in the modern world. The belief that, I don't want to hear your subjective feelings. Show me your stats and your tables and your facts. This is how DoD meetings happen. Bring up your spread. I want to see your PowerPoint presentation. Show us your mountains of data, and the mountains of data will tell us what to do so that none of us is at fault for the fact that we, accidentally killed off 500,000, Iraqi children. That's not our fault. The numbers made us do it. We were objective, right? And this is how the Nazis went about doing what that's why they put numbers on everybody. I can't be distracted by human suffering and actual expressions on people's faces. I want that to go away, and I want a little number that I can work with, because the number doesn't make any demands on my feelings, and it gives me the space I need to abstract and think in a systematizing way. This is, I know this from the, history of computer science I've studied intently. And so I know how much the rise of computers in the 20th century is associated with apocalypses and holocausts and other horrible things. It unfortunately appeals to people who want to abstract from the world. And as Donald and I both know, you can use computers in a healthier way than that. But we all have met people. It's impossible in the computer industry not to have met people who instead use it the other way, and it becomes a way to feed the demonism of hypernoesis. Says, this is great. I never have to see another person. I won't ever have to talk to anybody. It's just me and my keyboard, and I can do whatever I want. That's how laws are built in the modern world. That's how, you know, the economy is built in the modern world. And it becomes a substitute for reality. And that's what makes it possible for an incredibly powerful people to do incredibly foolish things that are self-destructive, because we lack the gnosis that would tell us, you know, maybe you shouldn't go around exterminating other human beings just to satisfy some sort of recipe for your population. Maybe you shouldn't chop down every last fucking tree if you ever want to breathe again. Maybe a certain amount needs to be preserved as the foundation for our society. And you shouldn't be, you know, overwhelmed into thinking that life reduces down to simple equations and mechanisms. It never does. So this is my response to James, is saying it's not that noesis itself is a possession, or that gnosis itself is a possession, but that there's something in us that makes it easy for us to try to reduce the complexity of a life lived in a dialectic between these two faculties to something simpler, a monomania, in which we pick one faculty and say, this will be the source of all of my truth. It's closely related to, you know, certain kinds of genocidal versions of medieval Christianity that we saw in the Middle Ages, where they said the world can know peace after we exterminate every other religion. We'll just convert them. Once they're all gone and we're the only ones left, then we can all be peaceful and good. And until then, die, heathen, die. Right? I mean, this monomania is the same monomania that says all of our answers should come from computers and laws and systems. As long as we exclude all human elements, the truth will surely emerge. And that is definitely a state of possession, and it's widespread. And even those of us like Kenneth or Nietzsche or I who critique this as a demonism, it doesn't change the fact that it's in us, because we've been marinating in this our whole lives. It's impossible to look at anything in the room around you without seeing the products of hypernoesis. And the extent to which our lives are utterly dependent, our survival within this artificial system is utterly dependent upon our proficiency at hypernoesis. And that's a problem. But it's the way it is. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what's on my mind is our relationship to instrumentation and technology. Whether we like it or not, we're so dependent on that. And whether that is a saddle or whatever, it's interesting. I'm thinking of particularly two instances that was very important. One is kind of like early Renaissance, I suppose, and the other is more contemporary. You know, when the world expanded, you know, and Columbus sailed the ocean blue under the New World, presuming it's India, the Portuguese went a different way. They wanted to go around Africa. And they depended on instruments. Apparently, the instruments they had at that time, I think, was something that reads the stars and the position of the sun and so forth. And at the equator, it switches. And by accident, it also happens that Africa at that precise latitude was curved and went into this dip, right? And so it was very, very inadequate, because suddenly the instrument failed because the experience from the northern hemisphere never experienced that and couldn't measure it. Yet, so that was still a world that at least many people believe that you know the world ends and falls off a cliff. So it's very perilous, and so they try to follow the near shore so they could be at least somewhat safe. But because it dipped into an inward turn, they couldn't find it. So that was a very, very stumbling part. And that's a relationship between instrumentation and the relationship between the visible and the invisible, because we couldn't depend on the instrumentation we at least had at that time. And so in some sense, it took a lot of courage and willingness to take risks to actually round that dip and then go on to Cape Hope, the Cape of Good Hope, and so forth, and actually succeeded in rounding Africa. So that was a failure of instrumentation that we rely so much on. It was very, very dependable in the Northern Hemisphere. The contemporary situation is the double slit experiment. Once again, the relationship between visible and invisible, right? And so double slit seemed to suggest that, in a sense, photons were both a wave and a particle, right? Because it seemed to do the same thing. And so we built a whole theory on that, but based on the instrument. And we have quantum theory, and then we built a whole structure of understanding, supposedly based on quantum mechanics, which is the world as a relationship between waves and particles, And so we have found, the so-called God particle that created a quantum field. So is that real? I'm not sure. It's like I sort of believe in it, but it's a prediction based on an instrument of the double slit. Is that enough to give us a confidence in the whole scheme that we projected out? I don't know, because Einstein didn't believe in that. He finally gave up and said, okay, you guys win. But he sort of said God doesn't play dice with the universe. And of course, the answer is like, who are you to tell what God should do?
Right.
In other words,
He had to
God
eat
could
those
play
words
dice with
later
the
in his
universe
career.
if he wants to, if there was a God. So in some sense, that sort of quieted Einstein down. He didn't have the right to criticize God if there was a God. So I just wonder, we're so dependent on instrumentation that we really almost have to believe it rather than maybe we should believe it. So I just wonder whether that's a trap or whether that is what exposes us to the invisible. I don't know,
Yeah.
I sort of believe in it. I sort of don't believe in it. So, so there you go. That's it.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I think another classic example of the ways that science shakes things up is the discovery of microscopy in the microscopic world. It's really interesting to read early books and papers that are excited about the discovery of, tiny protozoa. Oh my God, the pond is not just water. There's things living and wriggling around in it. And they write these essays and they're so excited. They're like, you thought your water was clean. You're drinking little animals. Did you know you're drinking little animals? And everybody's shocked and horrified. No, that can't be true. I know how the world is, and the world doesn't include, the world has a vacuum where you're inserting meaning and things, and you're not allowed to put meaning and things into my precious, precious vacuum. And it's hand in hand with the discovery that we're made out of cells. They're like, I'm a bunch of little animals. This is horrible. I'm supposed to be a perfect, pure thing, and I had this conception, and you're messing with my conception. Stop it! Stop it! It's really interesting. Part of why I love science. I have a friend who says, a friend from high school. I haven't talked to him much in years, although I see his posts on Facebook, and he says the purpose of science is to give you absolute truth. This is the purpose of science. It's because if you try to get absolute truth somewhere else, like religion, he says it doesn't work because people are just making stuff up and writing it down. But if you get it from science, then you have evidence and proof. And so the things you believe have a better foundation. And that's the important part. The important part is now you can be more confident. And I'm like, oh, sweetie, if only you could. The lesson's exactly the opposite. He's a funny guy. He's so sure of himself. And that's what science teaches him, is to be even more sure of himself. And I'm like, how can that be true when so many people, science is teaching them to stop being sure of themselves and to open themselves up to questions and to possibilities that they didn't conceive of? And for him,
and I also read an article, so Rick, about whether, because apparently hasn't there been some theory about there are more bacteria in our body than our actual cells in our body? So that's true. Who's doing the thinking? Is it bacteria that are thinking and making us do what we're doing, or is it our cells? What is it? I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's funny because, Buddhism teaches us to question our concepts of the self, Zen Buddhism especially, but but mainstream Buddhism as well says the self is a confusing subject. It's not a simple subject. But our tradition from Europe is that the self is very simple, right? It's your soul. Your soul is yourself. Your body is the spacesuit that you're walking around in. And, as soon as you can get rid of that spacesuit in a theologically approved way and migrate off to heaven, the sooner you'll be eternally happy. And Buddhism is like, oh no, simple answers about the self have no place. The self is very complicated and confusing, and it is one of the hardest questions there is. And this is also the ancient perspective. Why Gnothi Seauton? Why Gnothi Seauton? This is the trickiest of questions. So yeah, I mean, I really, when the study came out that did the counting of the archaea and bacteria and estimated how many cells of archaea and bacteria exist in our digestive system, and then compared that to the number of cells in our body, it said, holy crap, there's more of them than there is of us in us. Each of us is more not us than we are us.
I know.
Everything
So are we bacteria? I mean, are we really just a collection of bacteria? What is us? I mean, what is I?
Well, it suggests that the ancient Greeks, once again, were right about this, that it's not as simple as being we're an object and we're not anything that isn't that object. Instead, we're a complex ecosystem. And it takes a lot of cells from a lot of species to make one Homo sapiens, even though one Homo sapiens is supposed to be an element of a single species. It's like, yeah, we've got soil in our digestive system, we've got oceans in our blood. We basically have to carry the world around with us to be mobile. I'm going to call on Joe first because he hasn't gone yet today, and then I'll call on James second. So come off mute, Joe, and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just find it interesting because I think that there's the idea of understanding the infinite and the finite, and somehow we think we understand the whole. And then we you have to define those, right? Because the reason why is that there are an infinite number of possibilities within a finite set, right? So then you have that idea and you understand that. But then it's interesting, somehow we think we have this ability to abstract and kind of know everything and know what everything is the right thing to do. And it's almost as if, and it's not to say that things like probabilistic modeling and things like that aren't helpful, but it's just not absolute. And so there's the other idea that part of the thing is that I think we talked a little bit about the idea of objects and how they actually dictate what we do, and how things become about more the objects and not the relationships. And that's important to understand, because I feel like the more we feel like we can do and more objects we can create, the more we feel like we understand the whole. And it's like, no, that doesn't necessarily compute. That's not logical. And so this kind of like, we have this I don't know, it's kind of we fall into the same trap. The more that we actually think we can do, more in a materialistic sense, the greater that we think our understanding of the whole is. And it's like, no, that's just, you're just actually, kind of failing to understand that there is the seen and unseen, and there's a set of principles as to why you need to fall back on those principles in order to actually live harmoniously. And failing to do that is when you focus on the objects and not necessarily what's most important. And you start cutting down every tree, as you just mentioned a moment ago. Or you start, kind of, basically the creative destruction actually is just nothing but destruction at that point. And so, anyway, it's more or less, I ultimately ask and providing an answer as to why we're doing something in the first place, and having the humility and intellectual humility actually to know that we don't fully understand what the absolute right action is. And I stress the idea of the absolute, because that's almost, in a way, the minute we kind of overly rely on these things, it's almost a saying we have a picture of the whole, and we never have a picture of the whole, no matter what.
Yeah.
I mean, so
yeah,
and that's where infinity kind of comes into play, in the sense that there's an infinite number of possibilities within a finite set, but you don't, that doesn't mean you understand everything. That's, all the possibilities. So then therefore you need to rely on principles. A little abstract, but
it's good.
I think I made the point.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'm gonna cite an example. And part of the theme here is this theme of it's so hard to understand the world around us, even with science. It sort of becomes clear how laughable it is that we could understand the world inside ourselves better than that. Most people assume they know who they are. They don't know even these basic facts mostly, like how many cells are there in our microbiome compared to how many cells in our body. They don't know those things. But even that aside, just the fact that you can't see visibly with your eyes if you're wrong about what's going on inside your mind, because it's inside your mind, it's invisible, right? So if somebody, you think about what an interesting curiosity a optical illusion is. If someone shows you an optical illusion, and if you've never seen one before, you fall for it right away, and then the person showing it to you is like, he, well, let me show you how you've been fooled. Let's actually measure the two lines. Look, they're the same length. And you're sitting there going, but I can see that they're not, but the ruler says they are, but I can see that. Well, this is really weird, right? The very first time in their lives, they conceive of the idea that they're not seeing what's really there, that their mind is doing an enormous amount of processing beyond merely being a mirror or a lens. This is a new idea for people, and mostly people play with them or enjoy them when they're forced to, and then try not to think about them the rest of their lives, because they still want to maintain the illusion that they see things the way they are, other than a few weird boundary cases. But here's my example, and this is a tree killing example, but it's not about logging. On the contrary, one of the trees we have in the Pacific Northwest is called the Pacific Madrone. I think I've given this example once before, some months back. The Pacific Madrone, you might, sometimes people call it magnolia, but it's not. You'd know it because it's a messy tree. It's got a bark that peels off, and the bark underneath is a deep cinnamon red color, and it's very smooth. It's very interesting to touch. It's just a very smooth, not rough at all underneath the bark. And it's constantly peeling off new layers and dropping them on the ground. They call it litter. They say it makes a mess. Its leaves look like the leaves of rhododendron. They're sort of thick, hard, curved a little bit, dark. It's from the heather family. It's related to heather. It's related to blueberries and manzanita and things like that. So people love these trees. They grow in the weirdest places, like on cliffs, sticking out of cliffs all over the Northwest. Dry, hot spots in a wet climate, and in hospital spots where other trees don't thrive. And we've cherished them for a long time, but we began having a problem in the 20th century where they began dying. And everyone said, oh no, there's a disease. We'd learned about Dutch elm disease and, pine borer beetles. And we're like, okay, something's afflicting our beautiful madrone trees. Let's see if we can figure out what it is. So everyone started taking extra care of their madrone trees. And the more they took care of them, the more they started dying. More and more of them died. Half of all the madrone trees in the Pacific Northwest died off in the 20th century, before eventually a study figured out what the problem was. We were grooming them to death. And the specific grooming we were doing is, you ever seen that bit where a tree in a park, they clear the grass and everything in a circle around the trunk of the tree? Turns out that kills madrones. It kills madrones because their roots need to be cool. And the way that they're cool is they drop that messy litter all over it. And the litter suppresses many plants from growing there, but it encourages heather, manzanita, huckleberries, the sorts of things that will grow up and shade that spot and keep the roots cool. That's the conditions under which a madrone thrives. If you clean it all out of there, and make a nice, tidy little geometric hypernoidic circle on the ground, you kill the tree. So what was weird was the period after which we realized something was wrong, but before we stopped grooming them, we somehow failed to notice that the trees that were thriving were the ones we didn't touch, and the ones that were failing were the ones we were grooming. Because the grooming was it was an ideology in us. It was part of that French garden, Louis the whatever, all gardens have to be in geometric shapes. I want triangles and circles. The whole purpose of a garden is to reveal the human mind's mastery over nature, and we will make it jump through circles and, line up in little pyramids. And that's what it's for, is to mirror back our awesomeness to ourselves. So we couldn't stop making little circles on the ground around each one and tidying them up and saying, see, behold, I have groomed it. It was so unconscious, it was so ideological for us that we failed to notice that the only ones that were dying were the ones that we were touching. It's like the most obvious fact in the world. It was fine until I messed with it. It was completely inconceivable to us. And as a result, nobody detected it. It took a scientific study, a long time, for a process of elimination to figure out that the only thing that the dying trees had in common was we were messing with them. This is the power that an ideology or a delusion or a epoch has over its denizens. There are things that cannot be thought. There are surds that create lacunae in the fabric of the world. Those parts of the world don't exist for us, and so we can't question them. It's not like the oppressor who uses his fist to punch you and you say, look, somebody's punching me. I think my problems are over there where that guy's, the source of the fist is the source of my problems. Life would be easy if it was all evil empires. But instead, the source of our problem is our failure to appreciate something invisible. And the failure to appreciate the invisible thing is the source. It's causing us damage, but it's like having a poltergeist in your house. You can't figure out where it's coming from. I don't know why things are going wrong. So, I don't know, let's scapegoat the Jews or the immigrants or, drug use. Somebody must be at fault here. Let us find the bad guys and persecute them, and then everything will be fixed. All of that's much easier than saying, I wonder if our understanding of the world is full of holes like Swiss cheese. And the part of the universe that we're seeing and appreciating is a tiny fraction of the part that we need to see and appreciate in order to deal with it. People talk about the way you're trying to have a conversation with someone who's highly autistic, and meanwhile they're staring at a sunbeam, because in the sunbeam they can see all the dust motes glittering, lit up by the sun, and it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen. Why would they put down the immediacy of that powerful experience to pay attention to whatever bizarre thing you're trying to talk to them about? Right? There's no competition. This is hypergnosis, right? Competing with noesis, and it's the way in which the kinds of problems that we have in the modern world are the kinds of problems that are caused by our noesis being hypernoetic, because they cause us to overlook the sources of those problems, which could only be detected by investing in gnosis, which we hold in contempt. We call it irrationality. Don't be irrational, right? All bad things come from irrationality. So we don't look. And because we don't look, we don't notice what's actually happening there. The lion that's about to eat us is invisible to us. And despite the fact that the stakes couldn't be higher, we can't stop scratching the ideological itch, because we've always been scratching it. It feels right to scratch it. We don't even know that we're scratching it. We've been doing it so long. And this is the specific power that a state of possession has over us. It's how our character, like Ari said, it rides us. Like Kenneth says, like an invisible rider we don't even know is there. If we knew it was there, we might do something about it, but we don't know it's there because it's internal to us. There's no roadmap. There's no optical illusion to clue in that we're missing something, only cognitive illusions which are invisible to us. And likewise, the fact that it's not simple, but is instead augmented by all these myriad more temporary states of possession, these enthusiasms, these ideologies, these powerful experiences, means that even if we could see it, we'd be lost anyway. we wouldn't know which of the things to focus on. It's just a whole bunch of glittering motes. And which of them is the important one right now? It's like being dropped into a city you don't know anything about, and you don't have a map and you don't have a cell phone. It's like, I don't know where to start. It's why the ancients wanted us to focus on that problem, because we're at the bottom of our learning curve, and we're not going to get very good at it until we really work at it for a while and climb our way up the learning curve so that we can look around and see what the hell's going on. But most people don't even get out of it. This Kenneth Smith likes the line. It's like, on the great sea of life, too many people are still stuck on the shore because launching the boat was too big a challenge. All the real challenges are out there somewhere in the water. They're still back at the starting gate. Yeah, he's got I can't remember which parable it is. It's either from Otherwise or from Webb's. He uses that line, and again, the first time I read it, I'm like, that just sounds mean. But the older I get, I'm like, no, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. We aren't even trying to solve these problems. We think that they're unproblems. There's nothing important to be seen here. And that's why Daedalus couldn't get out of the labyrinth until he looked up. Because the labyrinth operated on 2 dimensions, and as long as he kept trying to solve the problem on 2 dimensions, the labyrinth would always win by making invisible the thing that he needed to see in order to figure out how to get out. That's how we're ruled. And this goes back to Stephen, right? A year ago, 2 years ago, you were talking about the thread that binds Fenris, the thread that binds the subtlest of chains that binds Fenris. If it was a big obvious chain, he could just see it and snap through it. It had to be something he can't even see, so he doesn't know why he's stuck. And then that works on all of us. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, wait, Joe, you have
really
something
quickly,
you want to add?
No, I mean, and I just want to make a quick comment based. It was something that is that this idea of blind certainty in a way, and it's interesting because I was at a university that one of the top universities in the world, and there was someone speaking beautifully. He actually just gave a very good presentation, and at one point though mentioned that, well, I know that we don't have all the answers at this point in time, which I was like, okay, that's news. And that it was 90, he said, but we have about 95%, and we have 5% that we haven't. And I'm thinking, where the hell did that proof come from? And it's like this idea that even the fact that you think you can quantify what you don't know is the problem in and of itself. It's like that's where, and literally, I mean, this is a serious discussion too. I mean, and made very good points outside of that, but I'm just thinking to myself that that's really an accounting for a lot. That the fact that there are an infinite number of possibilities, or even that we know, like this is the idea of knowing the whole. And so anyway, which is problematic, because then you start to use probabilistic modeling and Bayesian type of thinking as a way of actually making all your decisions, which in that case, you're making decisions mostly about objects and based on objects that you've observed. So anyway.
Yeah. It's a remarkable example, Joe. I mean, it is astonishing the certainty with which people will say how much of reality they know or don't know. It's like the only way you can know that is if you know everything, and you can count it up and say, now this is the percentage that's in my head and the percentage that's not. It starts out, it begs the very question it claims to answer. It starts out by assuming godlike powers of omniscience that can be then ratcheted back to, yeah, I know 95%. Well, if you haven't been to 95% of the places in the universe, I don't think you know 95% of what there is to know. And anybody who thinks they've been to 95% of the universe, it's like, it's amazing. And this is, I mean, it's not that people have never been silly like this before the modern age, but that it's normal to be silly like this in the modern age. And to think that there's nothing more than our laws and our economy and our logics, and that's pretty much everything important right there. And how would we know that? Through most of human history, people have been perfectly comfortable with the idea of a bonus of mystery that we don't get to know. Kenneth Smith uses the Sphinx as one of his metaphorical symbols. And it stands for the bonus of mystery, the things that we're never going to get to know. Because the Sphinx knows those things and we don't. Right? The real Sphinx, the deep Sphinx of ancient mythology, is not the one that just poses riddles and then, you know, one guy walking down the road comes up with the solution and then it's frustrated and throws itself off the rock and dies. That's not the real Sphinx. The real Sphinx is the one that knows everything, and it knows all the things that you don't know, and it knows what it's aware of is how big that freight of mystery is, and it becomes the symbol for it. He uses it repeatedly in his koans. So Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Well, first I want to ask, you know, James had his hand up and he put it down. And if he wanted to say something, I would invite him to go before me. If not, I'll go. James?
No, thanks, Phil. I'll talk later. Thanks.
Okay. What was I thinking about? Yes. I had a thought. Yeah. I guess it's been so long, I forgot what my thought is. I'll come back later.
Okay, sounds good. This is the nice thing about these seminars is, you know, we're by reworking the material deeper and deeper, it gives us chances to find it again later. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I've been building a little bit of a thought experiment that might bring some of these things together. The thought experiment is living as a human is kind of like being a captain and a crew on a ship. This is like the Cook model, and we have our instruments. And the idea is also to go to Joe and a little bit of a difference idea of the Bayesian brain is a meta version of it, where it's like also being Bayesian about when it shouldn't be Bayesian. And the idea is like this, that you're on your ship, and the 95%, I would argue, if you were saying something like this, is totally fine. Like, out of every 100 days, there's 5 days where our ship seems to be broken and we don't know why. And the idea is 95 out of 100 is 95% of the information. And I have 95% of the time I'm good. And I only have 5% error. And that seems to be that maybe that 5% error is enough to get our ship to be okay. And maybe it's not. And, you know, some idea is you get to have an emergency on one of these 5 days that's rare, and everybody in the ship is panicking. And in this case, you have this idea of, well, what do? We need to now fix this. Is it just the normal thing? We just bail water out of the ship because there's water going in, but we don't know where. You know, is it like the molecular structure is broken, or is it? And the idea is, how much energy, how much time are we going to spend looking for these solutions? Is it worth more than 5% of our total energy? If it's this 95%, then you say yes, because on emergencies, it definitely is. We're going to devote as much energy as we can to these things. And so in a state of healthiness, we're going to use this sort of genosis, where you're just experiencing everything. You're trying to take in all the data and you're trying to figure it out, and you're trying to look for new solutions, and like you find, like, looking for holes in the hull itself, right? Maybe there's 5 holes in the ship and you got to find them. And that's not something you have access to either. But you have to imagine these possibilities of what's the problem and how do I solve it? So the first one would be, are there holes in the ship? So we go looking and you find no holes. It's like, oh, there's holes in the sail. You look, there's nothing there. How long are you going to keep looking before you be like, oh, it's just that guy. He's the bad guy over there, and we need to throw him off the ship. And then, because it restores a sense of confidence. And the idea is you're willing to do this absurdity when you get close to panic. And this is going to take this model in a totally different direction of the nature of our society and human beings when they exhibit something called schizophrenia. That's the same thing with different microscopy and macroscopy, so to speak. And when a human being has this problem, there's a strange phenomenon that happens, that the level of paranoia, that's how afraid you are and how panicked you are, is related to how vastly different your experience of reality is than what's actually happening. Meaning, if your model is close to reality, you're not paranoid, you're not schizophrenic. But what happens is, when paranoia develops, is these models get crazier and crazier. Like, for instance, no one as a schizophrenic is afraid of their neighbor coming in to their unlocked door and then throttling them in their sleep. What they're afraid of is their neighbor is in control of a spaceship that's going to beam me up into their spaceship and then do all these horrible things to me in the spaceship. So the level of craziness, or we would say unlikeliness, of the scenario reflects the paranoia. And there's another strange relationship, is that the more delusional someone is about how they come up with some crazy thing that's happening to them, that's also the level of confidence they have, the more confident they are with it. And this is where our society is at right now. We have a very schizophrenic behavior where things are not matching up to the reality, and that's causing us even more confidence. And it's predicated on fear and paranoia. And it's this idea that we have this ship that's got a whole bunch of problems and we can't figure it out. We've looked all over here, we looked over here, we looked over here, and to some degree we've given up on looking, and we're just like, oh, just throw that guy off and the ship will be fine. And we keep just doing these sort of delusional behaviors that you see society is getting less and less happy. We're getting more and more fed up with. I don't know, our leaders, our societies itself, able to adapt and move forward. We're like have this terrible pessimism towards the future and climate change, that not only is there climate change, but we don't have much confidence in humanity solving it. It's not like we're like, oh, I'm a superhero, I'm going to fix this in 3 years. Boom. It's not like everybody feels that way because we're so awesome and we're so good at adapting. Everybody's like, crap, we're so locked into our thing. We just, right? And it goes, and we're just going, right? And so it's like, it's that process of schizophrenia that's really taken hold of our society as a disease. And to be honest, I'm well aware of this, and it's actually kind of why I go to groups, or this kind of group, is because it helps me get a better grounding on reality, and it takes away from the kind of schizophrenia of media and technology. I mean, it's almost like perhaps what Phil is doing with his cell phone is the writer is saddling us to the point of craziness. There we go. That's done.
Thank you, Ari. Phil, you thought of what you were going to say.
Yeah, I recall what I'm going to say. And it's really something that triggered my mind in a Heidegger meeting about phenomenology and the relationship of what to that. And the interesting thing is, I'll begin with, when I started my Fallen Angels series, I switched from being a sort of a 20th century avant-garde artist to something maybe a little bit more holistic. It's the relationship between art, philosophy, and the human spirit. And now there's some prominent thinkers think that perhaps this is the end of philosophy. And I wonder whether it is, because I like to have the relationship between art and philosophy and the human spirit. But there has always been a traditional relationship between, let's say, poetry or literature and philosophy. And I think it got sort of beginning to be divided with Plato. And I think the arts, and I'll just say literature, I don't want to toot my own horn in terms of visual arts, is maybe in some sense reuniting the two, or maybe even displacing philosophy, because the end of philosophy goes back to this sort of ambiguity of language and so forth, and understanding. And I think it has to do with the fact that reality, when we experience phenomenology, all we have in a way is a representation of being as it is, not the real. And I thought, like as a 20th century artist, primarily, I'm still doing art, but I'm kind of a 20th century artist. I think of the fact that it's not so much representation, but I hyphenated the word, representation. In other words, you're creating creativity within the representation itself that takes off from the representation. It is still not reality as such, but is merging out of the representation, ownership of actuality, which is how things are, because it retains the ambiguity, the language itself. In other words, there's still enough vagueness that it's open up to the whatness of that, which is the what. And I'll have an example of what happened with Impressionism that sort of began this. Because the 19th century did already do that, but they were working with the wrong form. And when the academic artists saw the Impressionists, particularly Monet, oh, they said, well, we understand the Impressionists. These are sketches. All they need to do is finish the work. Then we have it. And the Impressionist says, no, this is where the actuality actually happens. It's in ambiguity. In other words, the sketch is where it's happening, not the finished product, because you took it too far. The sketch is constantly revising and rethinking. And in the moment of your rethinking and creating the process, a representation, that is exactly how you're dealing with the phenomenology of the experience and try to recreate. And you want to say, God created the world? The little mind of man is recreating that. It's not actual reality, but it is the actuality that allows us to, in a sense, have a finite manifestation of that because it unfolds and requires the viewer to unfold it further and maybe another artist to unfold it further. And that means that we're trapped in this gray zone about the relationship between the now and the future and progressing to the future. In a sense, the horizon is this sort of sketch. All we have is a kind of a sketchy idea of what it is. And, like jazz is a good example. I get the gist of it. Let me create something that opens up the possibilities. And rather than, let's practice and practice until we get it perfect, because when you get the gist of it, you're entering in the process of sketching and opening up the possibilities. So somebody else in the band says, oh, let me add my sketch to that. And then we creates a relationship. And that's what the essence is. It's not in the finished product, but opening up the possibility for the human mind to continue sketching and progressing beyond the horizon. So that's important to know. We are trapped in the phenomenology, but we have a way out, which is to constantly feel and sketch a way toward it, rather than say, no, we finally got it. We got the absolute finished product. And it's the finished product that tricks you. Is that, that's absolute. No, that isn't. That's only a stage of the absolute, if there is an absolute. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah, that's a relationship of the what to that.
Yes. Yes.
Because we're trapped in the what.
Yes. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I like the way Phil put that hyphen in representation. That's a very Kenneth Smithian type thing, to break up words so you read them etymologically, and instead of in their sort of modern connotation, whatever, denotation. Anyway, I was going to. We seem to have lots of schemas today, so I was going to introduce a simple schema about virtues, since we're kind of talking about virtues, and it's quite Greek, that sort of to treat things in accordance with their nature, which would be kataphusei, maybe that kind of nature. The nature they have certain arche guide them, but they might also, if they're like human beings, they have their own character, which is a nature on top of that. But there's this idea that's always treat things in accordance with their nature. And I kind of like that. And at one point when I was childish, or certainly younger, I thought I saw in that idea
a unifying factor in virtue that are different, what we think of as different virtues. Because like piety is treating the gods in accordance with their nature. How should we? Or if we don't like gods, it's those forces of contingency that are outside our control and unknown to us. You know, in some of the philosophical classes, we always said, okay, they're talking about gods now, the Greeks. Let's just bracket that term and say, well, that's just some unknown thing that comes in. And then courage, we talked about this a little bit earlier today. How do we treat the future in accordance with its nature? It has its unknowable stuff, but do we turn to soothsayers and astrologers and whatnot? Or do we turn to what we would call today subject matter experts? That maybe the general can predict the course of the battle, or you know, the technician can predict the course of the behavior of something, whatever. The economist predicts better than the soothsayer what's going to happen with the economy in the next few years. And then there's sort of a kind of justice that's not this architectural principle or archetypal principle, but just how do we treat others in accordance with their nature, where we take into account their you know, what nature has given them, plus what they have made of themselves, their character, to treat them in a way that makes them better. You know, Socrates talked about justice in that. And then the last one, this form of just sophrosune. How do we treat ourselves? How should we treat ourselves so as to make ourselves better, to do good to ourselves? Sophrosune. Anyway, that's enough on schemas. I don't claim to know if this is 95% or whatever. You know, I think you're quite right that all those people that assert these universals, you know, I especially like, you know, we can't know everything. Well, how do we know that? Is it because we know absolutely that one thing that we can't know everything and that's absolute? Or I don't know. I think there's a great deal of wisdom in turning to myth, Greek myth, you know, to explore these things in a way that is beyond strictly noetic reasoning, whether it be Bayesian probabilities or other probabilities. Yeah, Bayesian recalculates after every piece of new information is the truth value is determined or the probability is determined. You get to recalculate, but I know what we do with that in computer science. I'm not sure if I ever think that way in life, though. Not that it's good or bad. I think subconsciously maybe I must. Anyway, enough. Have a good day.
Thank you, Donald.
That was great, Donald.
Yes. I always love it when you get exasperated enough to come off mute and share this stuff, And it always cracks me up when at the end of it, you leave it away that pretends that everything you said was completely worthless and you're sorry for wasting everyone's time. I mean, we're all going, right on, Donald. This is great stuff.
I might.
Where are you going?
You know,
Come back.
There is some place in Plato where he kind of offhand, it gets made that like courage is the greatest of all virtues, because without courage, we would never begin the philosophical journey. We would never try to live a philosophical life,
right,
because we don't know where it's going to end up. It may just end up with minds of mush. I don't know.
Yeah. James, you've been waiting.
Oh, all right. Thanks. Thanks, Rick. Yeah, thanks for the explanation of gnosis and noesis, because it seems to parallel, some modern ideas, like particularly Heidegger's idea of presence at hand and readiness at hand. Readiness at hand, is the that part of Dasein that is based on the truth of experience. That you know that you're on the track to disclosing being, if you are just involved in doing something like hammering without even thinking about it. And noesis, when for him, noesis is the present hand. When the hammer breaks down and then you can't hammer anymore, you have to figure out how to fix the hammer. So, but he prioritizes readiness at hand, and he criticizes the noesis as a kind of a thematic, or that kind of I think that's his how he understands science and technology as a kind of noetic enterprise that we're kind of like captivated by that kind of that kind of thematic or theoretical venture, and it takes us out of our a zone of experience, which is more true, because he believes that that's So, would you say that would would that be like a mythology? What to the Greeks, would the mythology be something like the noetic that also guides us into our right kinds of behavior? And maybe gnosis would also be represented by certain mythologies. So in our modern times, are we also subject to these mythologies? Mythology of science, mythology of gnosis, or right? And so yeah. So I was thinking about this, the modern philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. He really has an organic view of life, and that's consistent with what you've been talking about, the organic model of life. And he was also a scientist and a mathematician, and also he understood quantum physics when it first came out. He disagreed with Einstein, who didn't understand or didn't go into or even pursue the understanding of quantum physics. Actually, he was against it, I think. Yeah. But so he said that science and technology are necessary but not sufficient for understanding ourselves. And that's why he has his own philosophy of speculation about about the self and so forth. Very, very, very complicated, very metaphysical. So so I just want to ask you, is there a kind of understanding of our modern era by maybe somehow relying on the Greek model of these mythologies, and our modern pursuits, culture and so forth, forms of mythology that can be understood by way of what you talked about as gnosis and noesis?
It's a good question. I mean, Kenneth Smith would argue that we live in an anti-mythic age, not a mythic age. and that the hold that our ultra-rationalist ideologies have over us, it may occupy the same culture receptors within our character that mythology did among the ancients, but that doesn't make it mythology any more than saccharin tasting sweet makes it a sugar. There's a way in which we have certain needs for culture and a certain predisposition. To use the ancient terminology, we have a predisposition to being possessed by daimones, but it doesn't mean that every daimon that possesses us is healthy for us. And some of the ones, to be a culture, to be mythic, it has to be healthy. It has to be completing us and helping us to attain the mature adult form of the human mind. But if it uses the same receptors in order to prevent us from maturing into the mature adult form, if, for example, it pacifies us or infantilizes us, if it abstractivizes us, then it doesn't matter that it's using the same receptors. It's not a mythology, or it's not a culture. You know what I mean? In the modern world, our current dogma is that words mean whatever we say they are. We've become like the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland. You know, we think the majority decides what words mean. And the danger in that is that words are our mediation with the cosmos. And the implication that it doesn't matter whether we have a word to mean some specific thing implies there's nothing in the cosmos that matters. There's nothing that we have to talk about. There's nothing we don't dare lose our tether to, right? Because if the majority doesn't want to talk about it, it must not, ipso facto, it's not important all of a sudden. So if we all don't want to talk about death and we lose the ability to talk about it, then death doesn't control. We must live forever then because we voted it, right? That's what we decided. So we have this problem with terms like culture or free will or determinism or the sacred or mythology. What do these terms mean? And in the modern world, they don't mean anything. They mean whatever the latest vote was. Whatever the majority thinks it means today, that's what it means. And that implies there's no reality of any significance anywhere that needs to be talked about. But the old definitions of these things, it can only be a myth if it is helping to make the culture more vital and more healthy. Not like a tumor or cancer cell is healthy, but like it's leading humanity in the direction that we need to go as a species to develop our arites. If it's leading us the other way, then it can call itself a mythology all it wants, but it isn't one. It's something else. It's an ersatz mythology. So this is, one of the things that Kenneth does that he took a lot of flack for at the university level is, as a philosophy professor, he was teaching this value-laden, subjective, positive approach to philosophy. And lots of philosophy teachers got on him about that and said, you can't do that. That's primitive. You're teaching an unphilosophical way of life. Philosophers are supposed to be detached and moderate and rational. And he says, that's not a philosophical position. That's a modernist ideological position. Philosophers throughout history have been willing to have some feelings about things. Take Diogenes and his plucked chicken. I mean, there are ways in which you can't get at the roots of life by always being detached and abstract. But modernity can't imagine that, because for us, that is the only virtue. And anyone who says otherwise gets scapegoated as an irrationalist. So, it's a complicated thing. These are hard things to talk about because the very words we're using to talk about them are laden with ideology. The word mythology means different things to different epochs. Even science. Is science the beautiful ideal in which our ideas are tested against reality to ensure we're using both gnosis and noesis? Or is science a brand that corporations put on their products to justify releasing them to the market, even though they're largely untested? Right? I mean, I did some studies. I did some reading of FDA studies. Wellbutrin, the antidepressant, which people have been on for, at this point, some of them have been on it for decades. The full scope of the FDA study was 6 weeks. That's the sum total of the science, during which nobody got egregiously sick. Not 6 months, not 6 years, not 6 decades, and not tested with a whole bunch of other drugs to see how they combine. Just the drug by itself for 6 weeks. And that's the sum total of the science, the real science. That's as far as it goes. Everything beyond that is science branding without actual scientific method being applied to it. So it's hard to say, what is science? Is science a mythology? Well, we can't pin down what we mean by science, and we can't pin down what we mean by mythology. It's an important question. It's an critically important question. But until we sort of settle on a clear frame of reference for what we're talking about, it's unanswerable. Or worse, it's answerable in a cajillion ways, and then we can all argue about it, and then the time's up, and we've never actually understood one another. And so this is why it's so interesting to do the exercise that Kenneth Smith is inviting us to do in this book. He's saying, what if we actually pin down as much as we can what the ancient worldview was? Not what we want it to be, not what we fear it was, not our caricatures of it, but actually what is the core of its character? What is its nature? So that we can learn to try it out as a model, and we can agree upon its results. Then we have a frame of reference we can use to critique some of these slipperier things like modernity, which wants to claim to be everything to everyone at all times, and as a result, it's sort of hard to critique. Where is the there?
But you have to admit that
I've dodged your question, but I did so with the best of intentions.
Right. Thanks. But you have to admit that there is a, you have to assume that there is a, majority of people who believe in the science, particularly medical science, right, to a certain extent. Like the pandemic, they had to develop a vaccine that can treat people. But of course, you have anti-vaxxers, right, who refuse to take the vaccine. But without the vaccine, I wonder if we could have gotten out of the pandemic, So we do have certain amount of trust in science in order for us to even, operate and get along, navigate our lives on a daily basis, right?
Yes. And it's part of what's so interesting about medicine is because the stakes are so high, we allow a larger percentage of science to seep in than we do in other walks of life. But like political science, it'd be interesting to know if there was even a single grain of science anywhere in it. Right? Political science is mostly people's opinions about how right they are and how wrong everybody else is. And let me tell you my rationalizations for why mine is the correct answer. This is as far from, a vaccine for COVID as you could get in terms of the amount of science that's been applied to it. But the people who call those opinions of their science 100% believe that it's just as scientific as the vaccine for COVID. They can't distinguish the two from each other. Because science is the good stuff, and they know that they're the good stuff. So if it's coming out of their mouth, it must be science, right? And we use these terms, all of us use these terms in very slippery ways without ever noticing when we're modulating between one set of definitions and another set of definitions. So, medicine is a great place to look for some science that matters, but it's also an interesting place to look for the examples that don't work. It's something that medical professionals always have to be on the watch for is, what's the next thalidomide that comes along? That, yes, there was science behind it, but it was incomplete science. They never tested on pregnant women because they didn't want lawsuits from causing problems by giving experimental drugs to pregnant women, with the result that pregnant women were exactly the ones who manifested the worst excesses of thalidomide. We walked into it completely blindly. It couldn't have been a more perfect storm to create that disaster with thalidomide babies. And yet, it did involve the scientific establishment, and many of the rituals of science we went through, we just had our thumb on the scale at an unfortunate moment that caused catastrophic outcomes that a genuine science never would have done. Now, all of our science is constrained by economics. You don't know how many poor researchers there are who can't get a grant. There's vast amounts of science that needs to happen is held back by the exclusion of money. You don't have it, you can't do it. And the result is then an enormous amount of science that is done is it must produce positive results whether the experiment does or not. Otherwise, the guy loses his funding and then he loses his home, and now he's going to be homeless living under a bridge. So you bet it's going to produce a positive result. This is the thing, that the situation that we're in is neither all good nor all bad. We're in an ugly flux in which they're really confusingly mixed up together.
Yeah. Science conflicts with capitalism because it has to make a profit, right? And And so it can't be scientific if it's you're not making a profit. And that's why there's questions about global warming. So you have so many people disagreeing with global warming because there's the people, scientists who are working for Exxon, churning out reports that claim that there's no such thing as global warming. But but there's a certain amount of trust in the science that is saying that there is such a thing as global warming, and I think, I don't know if who's going to win out, but maybe it's 50-50.
Well, we love the brand of science, and we like science when it does the things we want it to do. We don't much like science when it does the things we don't want it to do. So we stop funding it when it's doing those things, or we just tell it it's wrong. It's our we moderns brand themselves as the first scientific epoch in history, but we keep our scientists as rent-a-slaves to make sure that they don't do science we don't want them to do. We don't want them examining scientifically issues about the law or justice, right? We don't want them messing with our structures of power. We don't want them messing with our big economic structures. So anybody who wants to do science on that stuff finds their grants evaporating and the money going to someone who agrees to keep their mitts off. So science is a very important brand for us. And there are many aspects of our lives that would be much worse without the science that we do permit to occur. But you have to think we would be living in a radically different world if we actually let science proceed freely to find out what's true and what's not. And that's why we don't let it do that. We're coming up on the end, so I'm going to let go of my agenda and just go with the questions. So Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just really quickly. Maybe and this is, my question is a simple way of kind of thinking about it. Mythos culture allows us to ask why, right? It's not ideological in the sense that where you're being told what to think. So, that would be a way of kind of making that distinction. One probes us to ask questions and to be open, as you were talking about a little bit earlier. But the real problem becomes is that when we think we're right in one domain, we start to think we're right in all these others. And that's a very perverted perspective on reality, because you're taking a very small sliver in the part and you're earlier. So it's the temptation, the idea that this is the same idea of the objects that we can create. Oh, great, we can do this so that we can do everything else. And it falls into a degree of hubris, and actually then we wonder why we objectify each other. So
yeah, thank you, Joe. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I'm wondering also, before I start, should I be limiting to a question, or can I share an idea?
Either one, but with the recognition we've only got 7 minutes left.
Okay, so I will do the shorter version then, which is more of a question or a proposition. A long while back, I had the thought, comparing this to Sun Tzu's Art of War. In there, there's two dichotomies that are pretty much sum everything up, which is know thyself and know thy enemy. That's generally the first rule. And the idea is the rule is just stated, know thy enemy, but there's an implication that he says that you can't know your enemy unless you know yourself. So but know both, and they're in relation to each other. They're both a part of the truth statement. You can't have one without the other. And the next one is that there's only two ways to think about how to deal with war or battle. You have strategy and tactics. Strategy is everything that you do beforehand. He calls it all your decisions or calculations or gods that you pray to. And Otherwise, tactics are what you actually do on the battlefield, the application of whatever you're doing. And this seems to break down very nicely with noesis being strategy, what you do imagine in the world of the imagination, purely calculated and thought based on rules and culture and calculations, right? And then tactics is the experience of battle. He says that's what happens on the battlefield. So you're immersed in every moment and you're not thinking about anything. You're just applying whatever training you have. This is where he says you apply the strategy. So if you've been practicing with sword and shield or with spear and shield, right, you just use the spear and the shield exactly the way you're trained and you don't think about it at all. And to me, this sounds very much like genosis, where you're just doing, and there's complete doing, you're complete immersement in the moment, and there's zero thinking. And of course, in reality, on the battlefield, even there's a little bit of both always. But generally, on the battlefield, you're almost exclusively just applying the knowledge that you have. You're not trying to think about the knowledge. And I was wondering how much you think that holds up, that model.
Yeah, that's a reasonable comparison. And the only caveat I'd put on it is that it is the modernist value system that says gnosis isn't thinking. Yeah, it's Hegel says gnosis, what he calls begriff, is thinking. It's just a form of thinking that moderns don't value. And so we deny it the exalted status of being reason or thought. But in fact, Hegel says all noesis would be impossible without gnosis. The only reason that we can make plans is because we've had enough experience to generalize from. And likewise, the whole reason we make plans is because of these sub-rational impulses that drive us in one direction rather than another. And so we try to solve one problem and not another problem. So kind of the bigger picture is that we've got two modes of thought, one of which holds the other in contempt and calls it non-thought. But tactics and strategy, any martial artist, Sun Tzu would be a good example, would certainly argue that, you can't have one without the other. You can't succeed if you say, I'm only going to take one and I'm not going to take the other one. It is in the dialectic between them. And in the same way, that's sort of what Hegel and Aristotle are implying about the mature adult human mind. It's supposed to be a dialectic of gnosis and noesis. So that, in effect, what you're doing is neither one, but absolutely depends on both of them. But this is, as moderns, we don't have any language for this. I mean, this is none of this stuff do we have. So thanks for bringing that up. Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Well, science is an instrument for knowledge and it has both a good side and a bad side. No doubt, having the scientists invent a vaccine that cures COVID, I think that's a good thing. However, it seems, at least with some ambiguity, that might have been the same aspect that created the evil, the badness society, which is the relationship between power and goodness. I mean, there's sort of some, at least, believe that in Wuhan, it was developed in a lab as a weapon. And of course, that's made vague because of the wet market and they put it on that. I'm not so sure if that's true. If that's the case, we would not have needed a vaccine if it didn't appear in the world to begin with. So in some sense, it seems to be a battle between the will to power and the will to goodness. And that becomes the problem. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's kind of, there's this idea, it'll become clearer in the later chapters, this idea of we don't really know what science could be. We often treat the science that we have as though it is the science it could be. But the science we have is a captive of the market. It's only able to sometimes be allowed to do its function properly. And at other times it's constrained or driven in the wrong direction. So these are hard discussions to have because we have a lot of emotions about science. I love science. I'm crazy for science. But I'm frustrated by the ways in which it's prevented from doing the things that it's supposed to do. And I recognize its limitations. Kenneth Smith has really clued me into seeing the parts that are missing from it. which would be a whole other discussion for some other day. But part of what you put your finger on there is, we can talk about the hypotheticals, but there are plenty of concrete examples, just like you're saying, where we wouldn't have needed science to solve the problem if we didn't have the science that created the problem in the first place. So like, how are you supposed to deal with the nuclear waste at hand for nuclear reservation? This is not an abstract discussion for me. I mean, Beverly grew up downriver from Hanford. This is like, right, her family has a high rate of cancer in Walla Walla, Washington. I wonder why. So, we wouldn't have the problem of how do you clean up that waste if we didn't have the breakthrough that created nuclear power in the first place. And most importantly, if we didn't have market conditions that encourage people to cut corners in the ways that they went about utilizing, nuclear power. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you're still muted, Sharon. There you go.
Yeah, okay, the button finally worked. Well, all of this sounds very intimidating. And simplicity is my middle name, simplicity and optimism. So right now I'm reading Heraclitus, and I thought about a quote that I read last week. It says, allow yourself to think only those thoughts that match your principles and can bear the light of day. Day by day, your choices, your thoughts, your actions fashion the person that you become. Your integrity determines your destiny. And it is in changing that you find purpose. So this is not as difficult as it is. Engagement, I prefer the word engagement to being saddled with anything. I think you're engaged with certain faculties in their life, and it's up to you to make the best of them. So that's my contribution for today.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, it's a critical piece of all this discussion about the ways that we're constrained by our character, that that's only half of the picture that Heraclitus paints, because he also paints the picture that the purpose of talking about this is to make clear the responsibility that we have to take ownership over our character and to try to cultivate it in a better direction so that we can make better choices. So it's definitely not about saying that nobody has a choice, although
Exactly.
that's an easy read.
And different characters go off in different directions.
Yes.
Based on circumstances and opportunities and environment. And that's why we have diversity in the world. And sometimes it's not productive, and sometimes it's unproductive, and sometimes leads to joy, and sometimes it leads to pain, but it's always growth.
That's right.
Always.
The one thing we always can be sure of is that it's going to grow and develop. Thank you, Sharon.
Yes.
Well, with this, that's our session for today. I'll see you all next week, and I hope you have a great.
He wants me to post that quote, though. Ari.
Alas, we're wrapping up. But if you can collect it for next time. I was just asking
if you could post the quote. Do we have time for that? I don't know or we could send it next week. If you can just save it. I'll anticipate it next week.
All right, I'll put it down and I'll send it next week because Rick wants to close out.
Yeah, sounds great.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.